Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Before the video starts, I'd like to raise awareness on a friend's GoFundMe. Her family restaurant has been going through some hard times, and I thought I could help them by raising awareness for it on my own channel. A link to it will be provided in the description. Please donate any amount of money you want or spread awareness for it however you can. I'm not asking for much, just to give a moment of your time to help them out. Any form of help would be deeply appreciated. Thank you.
I'm gonna give you to the count of 3, Stitch. 1.
Wow, I hate you already. Disney, I'm sure this isn't the first, second, or even the millionth time someone has said this, but what the fuck? You used to be good. A unique company focused on animation and exploring the boundaries of what can be done with cartoons. You used to make content that was actually worth people's time with hit after hit like Snow White, or The Lion King, or Lilo and Stitch, or Tangled. You used to be your own thing, not trying to merge with any other companies to have an original identity in the industry. Now look at you, turning the industry into a monopoly by purchasing Lucasfilm, Marvel, 20th Century Fox, and Fortnite for some reason, shitting out terrible or at least subpar sequels to stories that were already given satisfactory conclusions in a pathetic attempt to make money off of people's nostalgia. Granted, you did that before, but at least you kept that crap to direct-to-home releases. Now you're giving that garbage theatrical releases. I mean, really. Frozen 3? Why are you so confident you can pull off a Frozen 3 when you couldn't even pull off a Frozen 2? Even your original content these days isn't anywhere close to holding a candle to the classics and masterpieces you used to give us. Creatively bankrupt doesn't even begin to describe your current situation, and nowhere is this more apparent than your determination to take every one of your animated classics and convert them into worthless live-action remakes, devoid of anything and everything that made the original so good. I know I'm not saying something that hasn't already been said by millions of other people, but it cannot be stated enough just how offensive and horribly made these live-action remakes are. From entirely misrepresenting the original story to just making it the exact same thing but with less rewatch value. These movies more than deserve every last ounce of hatred and negative reception they've received, and I'm more than happy to do my fair share in ripping into them. And what better way to do it than with a good old ranking video? You know, so I won't have to make like 20 other videos about how these movies suck. Now before we begin, I should probably mention this to anyone who's really expecting me to dissect these movies. As much as I would really like to, this is only gonna be a standard assessment of these movies' qualities rather than a full-on analysis of them. I'm sure people will be disappointed that I'm not doing a deep dive analysis on these movies to really delve into what makes them so bad, but if I did that we would be here for like 15 hours and there's other stuff I have to work on, so yeah. I'm also gonna disclude any sequels these movies might have. I'm sure people would like to see me rip into The Looking Glass or Mistress of All Evil, but I can't really call those remakes as they're more original ideas and concepts the studio produced as follow-ups, as opposed to adaptations of the animated movies. And although it's technically listed as a live-action remake, I've decided to not cover The Sorcerer's Apprentice. It's not a remake of a full-length feature film as much as it's an adaptation of a slightly abstract short. One more rule. Although I won't be covering any sequels to these movies, I will be looking at anything that serves as a prequel to the story of the movies just to make sure Cruella doesn't get left out. I know this rule is a bit of a cheat, but I just feel really dirty about the idea of leaving Cruella off this list, because it really deserves to be ripped into. So let's not stall any more time and get right into the landfill. Will we come across at least one good one, or are all of them irredeemable crap? Only one way to find out. Let's get this show on the road.
I hate you! I hate you! I hate you! I hate you!
Fuck this movie. Absolutely fuck this movie. It is a revolting excuse for an adaptation of a beloved classic, and every single retarded piece of shit who helped it get to over $1 billion at the box office should be ashamed of themselves. Forgive me if I'm starting off a little strong or heated here, but it cannot be stated enough how much of a disgusting piece of vile this piece of quote-unquote entertainment is. Other Disney remakes get flack for making dumbass changes to the story that end up hindering the quality of the overall film. But The Lion King 2019 manages to be the worst of them all by doing the opposite. They don't make any changes to the story whatsoever. Instead, it is a direct copy-paste Control-V imitation of the 1994 animated film, and I mean that in the absolute worst sense of the phrase. Because here's a genuine question. Why would anyone on this planet ever choose to watch this version of The Lion King over the original when it is literally the exact same thing, but with worse pacing, worse character writing, worse expressions because of how hyper-realistic they made everything, worse comedy, worse musical numbers, worse voice acting, worse action sequences, worse cinematography, and an abhorrent butchering of what's supposed to be one of the most emotionally impactful moments in cinematic history?
Long live was that?
The backgrounds are literally the only thing worthy of praise in this revolting, irredeemable excuse for a feature film. Everything else about it is horrific. They really should have just gotten someone else to do the voice of Mufasa, because this was around the time you could tell that James Earl Jones was not exactly the best choice for voice acting. Every line of dialogue coming out of him is extremely dry and vacant, with none of the emotional and raw expression he had 25 years prior. There was literally zero sense in getting him back if he wasn't going to be able to properly re-record these lines, especially since they were willing to recast every other character in the movie. It was just a miserable nostalgia exploitation tactic to make money off of his likeness, and the other voice actors are just as terrible. Every single one of them sounds like they just wanted to collect their paycheck and go home, with absolutely no devotion to properly recreating the vocal performances of the original movie. The only ones who come close to at least trying are John Oliver, Seth Rogen, and Billy Eichner. And even then, they're completely obnoxious in their attempt to foam in these performances. Like, do I even need to show you the scene where young Simba is calling for help after his dad died? Or the first scene with Scar challenging Mufasa? Or Simba and Nala's argument over him not wanting to return to Pride Rock? Every single performance in this movie screams, we did all this in one take. To the point that I have actually seen AI videos with less empty voice acting. And in spite of the story being practically the same, the pacing is horrific. They spend so much time flexing over how groundbreaking their visuals are that they felt the need to drag out so many scenes that were already just the right length in the original. Like, for example, the original mouse scene before Scar appears is about 10 seconds. The remake calls it around for over a minute before Scar even appears on screen. What the fuck was the point of that? There's over 20 minutes of padded garbage in this movie where literally nothing is happening. You're just watching the filmmaker stalling to excuse the movie's almost 2-hour runtime. Fat that could have easily been trimmed out and you would lose nothing. But oh no, we had to lug the movie around with scenes like Simba's hair traveling across Africa, or how it got caught up in a piece of excrement, or how Nala escaped Pride Rock, or pointless banter about how Simba isn't a real lion because he wants to catch butterflies instead of eating an antelope, or a pep talk with Timon and Pumbaa about how the circle of life is actually a line. And apparently that was more important than things like Rafiki's lesson to Simba about running from the past or learning from it. Yeah, you heard right. They completely removed the scene that was supposed to be the crux of Simba's character development. Never mind a creative way to demonstrate the movie's message about learning from the past while developing Rafiki's character as a wise messenger. Let's just have Disney shove it down your throat with ham-fisted dialogue. Granted, this is a general problem with the remakes, throwing in a bunch of filler to justify the longer runtime, but at least the other remakes did something with their filler. Something to make it seem as if something was happening on screen. The Lion King 2019 does nothing. Absolutely nothing with its additional runtime. Nothing to justify wasting your life on its worthless existence. The musical numbers are completely terrible. Not only are the vocal performances subpar, but there's practically no interesting visuals or rhythm to the songs. Remember all those vibrant and bombastic visuals from I Just Can't Wait to Be King? Well, now it's just watching the characters running through a field. Remember how stunning and raw Be Prepared was with its sinister colors and venomous vocals? Now it's just Scar talking to the hyenas. He's not even singing in this one. He's just shouting the lyrics of the song. Are you fucking kidding me? Did you seriously have Can You Feel the Love Tonight taking place in broad daylight? You seriously couldn't even get that right? How incompetent are you? Every musical number from the original is butchered in favor of this Kids Bop slop, with no heart or passion to them whatsoever. And I know this is like saying water is wet at this point, but good God, the facial expressions are fucking abysmal. There's gotta be like 20,000 shots of the characters' faces in this garbage and not one registered at all. Like, I am not kidding you. This is the look on Simba's face while looking over Mufasa's dead body. Yeah, because that's the face I would have after I just saw my father die. This is all you need to understand how horrible the animation is. Not an ounce of feeling in anything. And it also carries over to the body language of the characters. Nothing to translate any emotion. No droopy ears or flailing of anyone's tail. There's no sense of life in any of the character models. And it's not even just the animation. All of the characters are also badly written. Remember Mufasa telling Simba how scared he was about losing his son? Demonstrating how even the bravest of men carry a sense of fear at the thought of losing their loved ones? Well, they threw that in the trash compactor in favor of Mufasa ranting about the dynasty being put in jeopardy. What the— do you not give a shit about your son's life? You're more worried about the pride and the bloodline? That makes me think that if Simba actually died, he would have just forgotten about him and made another kid. That's horrible! Nala is rewritten to be a girl boss in the continuing trend of girl bossing the female leads because Disney apparently just views the animated counterparts as bland love interests for the male leads. Young Nala is rewritten to be less playful and mischievous, which just makes her less interesting. Rafiki is just a generic old guy with no sense of humor to his dialogue or body language. Scar is deprived of his snake-like personality and turned into a boring brute. The hyenas are rewritten to be less comedic and they replaced Ed because apparently Disney doesn't give a shit about the disabled. Zazu is more annoying. Sarabi doesn't do anything with her additional screen time. Timon and Pumbaa are less funny, and Simba is less interesting because of how devoid of emotion they made him. It's like the dollar store version of the original script, just going through the motions without any understanding of what made the original story so good. Even the way the film is shot and choreographed is painfully bland and dull. The original movie took creative liberties with the fact it was animated, resulting in a lot of captivating shots and perspectives. The visual direction was sublime, majestic even. There was so much imagination put into how the audience would view the story, taking advantage of every high, low, and grounded angle. But not in the live-action remake. Every shot in this movie is bland live-action dribble. None of the cinematography is ever captivating or eye-catching. It's just boring wide shots of CGI animals and environments. Not a single frame of this movie is given any sort of scope or encompasses any of the original spectacle. I feel like I'm watching a documentary as opposed to a large-scale remake of an already huge animated movie. But that's an insult to documentaries because they would have more geometry to their cinematography than this horse shit. Every single second of this movie is a waste of breath. To say it's an insult to the original and everyone who worked on it wouldn't even scratch the surface of how deeply bad it is. I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with my decision to rank this as the worst remake as opposed to something like Mulan or Pinocchio, since they have a worse misunderstanding of the movie they're based on, but at least there was something different about them. As horrible as they are, I can at least come up with something more unique or original to say about them because of how they're not just copy-paste Control-V adaptations. Something more to work with or more to say because that's what a remake of an old movie is supposed to do. The Lion King 2019 gives you absolutely nothing to work with, because it's literally just the exact same thing, except they deliberately fucked it up in pursuit of nostalgia exploitation. This goes beyond being a shitty adaptation of the story or having a horrible understanding of the source material. This is M. Night Shyamalan's The Last Airbender levels of butchering and bastardizing every single aspect of the original that was good. Mufasa's death, the voice acting, the animation, the cinematography, the characters, the story, the pacing, the songs, the music, the comedy, the action sequences. All of them are neutered and spayed in this Redbox ripoff of a movie that should have never been remade. If it wasn't for the Star Wars sequel trilogy, I would be able to confidently say that this is the single worst thing that Disney has ever produced. From its abhorrent representation of Disney's crown jewel that revolutionized animation as an art form, to its effortless disregard for trying anything new, The Lion King 2019 is a sexual assault on your senses all the way to the credits. If you ever see a physical copy of this thing in someone's home or in a store, I implore you to destroy it on sight immediately. Smash it with a hammer, douse it with gasoline before setting it on fire, throw it into a shredder, anything to erase it from this world, because one less piece of evidence of this atrocity's existence is a net positive for all of mankind.
You will make good firewood!
How? How do you fuck up something so simple? Out of all these live-action remakes, this one should have been the easiest for them to not fumble like a kid with Parkinson's disease. Maybe it wouldn't be as good as the original, but at least it would be something worth watching. Pinocchio is as simple of a fairy tale as it gets. It's about a wooden puppet brought to life by a fairy through the wish of a generous and kind-hearted woodworker for him to be a real boy. And in order to become human, he must learn and abide by the rules of honesty and human selflessness. And yet, Disney found a way to ruin it. They ruined a story teaching children about how lying is bad. Aside from the extremely obvious surface-level things like the abominable CGI, removal of alcohol because modern Disney is run by pussies, making Monstro a mythical creature for no reason, the shameless fan-pandering with that scene where all of Geppetto's clocks are just references to other Disney movies, the ridiculous climax where Pinocchio develops superpowers to help them escape Monstro, the horrific pop culture references with Honest John talking to Pinocchio about how he could be an influencer or how he could be named Chris Pine, or the abysmal casting of Cynthia Erivo as the Good Fairy.
Holy sh**! You look like you have cancer!
This entire piece of horse excrement is extremely painful to get through. Let's start with the terrible tone. Pinocchio was an extremely dark story, like it was actually very terrifying. The original movie understood this and demonstrated all the shocking and terrible things that can happen to Pinocchio as a punishment for misbehaving. Stromboli literally tells him that he's going to kill him slasher movie style and use his corpse for firewood after he outlived his usefulness to him. It was dark, but it was appropriate for the story they were adapting. It was a grim, dark fairy tale that used specific techniques to teach children life lessons and the consequences of being a bad person. But the 2022 remake decides to make it more child-friendly because they didn't want to scare the mentally impaired 3-year-olds this was obviously made for. The remake never captures any of the darkness or grim nature the original had. The entire movie just feels too whimsical and cheerful, sanitized of the iconic moments that made the original stick out for so many people. Because of that, there's no real stakes in the story because there's no real sense of danger. Now, to be fair, the 2D animated film is guilty of this too. They did cut out a lot of the more graphic content from the book to make it safer for a family audience, but they still managed to stick to darker aspects in some form. The remake honestly feels like a toddler version of the original book. All of the grimness and darkness that would have made it more faithful to the source material is completely desaturated. And you know what makes it even worse? That's not even in the top 10 worst things about this remake. Questioning the remake's more lighthearted tone might not have been worth it if they still managed to tell the story faithfully or properly represented the original characters. Well, this movie only is in second to last place on this list, so guess how that turned out. For starters, Jiminy Cricket is a complete non-entity in the film. They're constantly making up excuses to separate him from Pinocchio before having him develop a relationship with him. And he never actually does anything to be a guide to him. He barely interacts with Pinocchio throughout the entire thing, and he never influences the plot. He might as well not even be a character in the story because there's no dynamic between him and Pinocchio at all. They also threw in a pointless subplot with him being friends with an annoying seagull that adds nothing to the story, and they removed elements of his personality like his short temper and self-doubt. The original Jiminy wasn't perfect, but at least he made an effort to be a guide for Pinocchio. He was an effective character in the narrative and had his own flaws like Pinocchio did, which added chemistry to their relationship. But in the remake, he's just a background element, something that could have easily been cut out and nothing about the story would have changed. Then you have Tom Hanks as Geppetto, and this is probably him at his worst. His acting is extremely corny and it looks misdirected, and he never properly interacts with any of the CGI characters. He also puts on this extremely fake accent that he drops on a dime. What's the point of trying to sound Italian if you're not gonna try and commit to it? And what was the point of giving him a sad backstory if they never expand on it? They briefly mention him losing his wife and son, but then it never has an effect on the entire movie. A lot of the visuals are also extremely ugly and oversaturated. The contrast in Geppetto's town is too bright, which washes away the more unique color style the original had, and Pinocchio himself never properly interacts with the world he's built into. There's no weight to his interactions with the human characters, and the lighting on him doesn't even properly blend into his environment. It makes most of the movie extremely hard on the eyes, unlike the original, which was much more lavish and gentle. And while it's not as bad as The Lion King, the pacing is also extremely disjointed. A lot of stuff ends up dragging for too long because herp-a-derp we have to throw in new subplots to justify the longer runtime. There's a new character they threw in as Stromboli's assistant, which just makes his section of the story longer without updating it in a meaningful way. She never develops a memorable relationship with Pinocchio, and there's a stupid subplot about her plotting against Stromboli to help take back the puppeteering business from his control. They never even show it happening. They just say he got arrested off screen. There's no payoff for introducing this subplot, so why was it in the movie at all? The Pleasure Island sequence is dragged out longer, and there's this dumb change where the coachman uses these shadow creatures to round up all the kids turned into donkeys, and it's completely ridiculous. In a movie where the heroes are chased by a giant whale, this is the most unbelievable thing. The songs are also very badly watered down with unremarkable visuals and vocals that are extremely uncanny. I had the hardest time sitting through this movie's rendition of No Strings on Me because of the voice actors' horrible singing and the boring cinematography. And the changes they made to the story are so horribly handled, like how the good fairy only appears once. She was supposed to occasionally appear as a guide to help Pinocchio, teaching him about the consequences of lying, helping him out of the cage, and sending him a letter to help him find Geppetto. But here, she only appears once to sing a bland, shitty song. She has no involvement in the story to the point that she might as well not even be in the movie. Maybe it could have just been some magic in a shooting star that brought Pinocchio to life. And unlike the original where Pinocchio doesn't go to school, here he actually does go to school, but he's kicked out for not being human. So now Pinocchio doesn't go to the theater because his naivety was taken advantage of. Now it's because he literally has no other choice. But the worst one by far is easily Pleasure Island. This is supposed to be a really dark and scary place. Just looking at it makes you feel uncomfortable because you recognize embrace the disturbing undertone behind the island. It's a dark and gloomy place that encourages kids to behave badly, like smoking tobacco and destruction of property. Here it's turned into a colorful and candy-coated amusement park. That's not what Pleasure Island is supposed to be. It's supposed to be foreboding and eerie, which helps to emphasize the horror of the donkey transformation later. I guess the idea was to make the place more cheerful and alluring to catch you off guard more, but it's a stylistic choice that doesn't complement the dark tone they're trying to establish. Even the donkey transformation is extremely dull and unimpactful. Like, look at how it was done in the original. The build-up to it is slow and subtle, which makes the terror of the situation more shocking. The music becomes more sinister little by little until it finally bursts into a nightmarish score that exemplifies the horror of what's happening. And the voice acting is heartbreakingly chilling. Listening to Lampwick screaming and panicking, calling for help, falling to his knees begging for mercy, his hands shape-shifting into hooves, that last cry for his mother before completely losing his humanity, that was the closest to an R-rated horror movie that Disney has ever gotten. And the worst thing about it is that Pinocchio can't do anything to help. All he can do is escape and save himself. It was a moment of supernatural horror that really hit home the consequences of falling for temptation, but the remake does it in a way that makes it less scary. The music is comedically whimsical for some reason, the line readings are rushed and lacking the desperation the original voice actor had, and the horrible CGI is more cringe-inducing than disturbing. The remake just lacks the terror the original had, making it more of an afterthought than something that sticks with you years later. But these aren't even the biggest sins the remake commits, and I think you might already know where I'm going at with this. The worst thing about Pinocchio 2022 is how it completely ruins the theme of the original story by misunderstanding Pinocchio as a character. The movie is supposed to teach people about the consequences of bad behavior and lying, right? And it does this by having Pinocchio engage in these temptations and then have him face consequences for it. Well, in the remake, Pinocchio never does anything himself. Instead, he's forced into these situations against his will and taken hostage. Remember how I said earlier that the school kicked him out, leaving him with no choice but to go to the theater? The whole movie is like this. There's never a situation where Pinocchio ends up in a bad situation by his own actions. It's always the result of someone else doing things for him. It completely ruins the message of the movie by making it so that Pinocchio is absolved of taking responsibility for his own actions because he never takes these actions of his own accord. And it also makes the movie extremely fucked up by constantly punishing Pinocchio despite him never doing anything to deserve it. He didn't choose to skip school, the school kicked him out. He didn't choose to go to Pleasure Island, he was taken hostage and intimidated into staying in the carriage by the other kids. Okay, Pinocchio, for being kidnapped and held hostage while being thrown out of school through an act of discrimination, we're gonna chop you into firewood and then turn you into a feral donkey. Sorry boy, but that's just how the cookie crumbles. And on top of that, they make it so that lying is actually a good thing by benefiting Pinocchio and escaping from Stromboli. They literally did the Shrek 2 thing, except it's not played as a joke. It's played straightforward. Now the lesson is lying is okay as long as it's in a situation that benefits you. What a load of horse shit. And worse still, they utterly butcher Pinocchio's character by making him a perfectly behaved kid from the very beginning. A Gary Stu who can do no wrong. He hesitates to do bad things, goes to school like he's told, never engages in any of the misbehavior at Pleasure Island, never gives in to temptation, never allows himself to be persuaded by others, never disrespects his authority figures. In fact, why did he even form donkey ears and a tail? He never does anything to emulate jackass behavior throughout the entire movie. Pinocchio is no longer a character because he never makes choices he has to learn from. And so he never drives the story with his own actions. He learns nothing because he's a perfect little boy from the start and goes through no character growth whatsoever. He's already a squeaky clean image of how parents want their kids to behave, and thus never has to struggle to earn his humanity. Actually, now that I think about it, why doesn't the good fairy just make Pinocchio a real boy from the start? Apparently he's already built in with all the good behavior that was expected of him, so him being a puppet throughout the entire movie makes no sense. Pinocchio is supposed to grow a conscience over the course of the film, not have it built into him from the get-go. Because Pinocchio is supposed to be about learning about how lying and bad behavior and giving into certain temptations is a bad thing. By having Pinocchio being well-behaved and not getting in trouble and hesitating to do bad things and listening to his authority figures from the very beginning of the film, it takes away from the emotional impact of the ending when he fully embraces the virtues of being a good little boy and is rewarded for it by being turned into a human. Which, might I remind you, is the entire point of the story. It's like they were afraid of making him too flawed or unlikable because they didn't think the children watching this would be able to relate with this literal, actual child about making mistakes and learning from them to grow as a person. Pinocchio doesn't even have a personality at this point because of how badly they sterilized him. The original Pinocchio was a very human character because he behaved exactly how a lot of kids would act at that age. He liked giving in to temptation and engaging in bad behavior. He liked the idea of rebelling against authority. And the lies he told were relatable to how a kid would try to get themselves out of a situation through telling tall tales and making up obvious nonsense. And it also made sense for Pinocchio to be easily manipulated by characters like Honest John and Stromboli because he was just born. His naivety was taken advantage of because he doesn't have all the common sense that other people would have after years of experience. But after experiencing the consequences of these things, he learns from them and puts forth an effort to improve. The original Pinocchio had to work for his humanity. He had to earn it through trials and tribulations and sacrificing himself to save Geppetto. In the remake, he doesn't even sacrifice himself to save Geppetto. He just magically brings him back to life with Pikachu tears. And they don't even show him turning into a real boy at the end. They just leave it up to interpretation because they were too lazy to commit to a satisfying ending. Because of all these horrific changes to the story, Pinocchio no longer has any agency in a movie where his name is literally in the fucking title. Making mistakes to learn from and adopting the virtues of honesty and selflessness were his character arc. The remake completely erases the character arc from the movie. That is a cardinal sin that I don't think any of the other Disney live-action remakes are guilty of. And Bob Iger deserves to be hit across the skull with a hammer for thinking this was acceptable. Of the 3 Pinocchio movies that came out that year, this is easily the worst one. It's even worse than the Russian version on Netflix. At least that one was entertainingly bad, and had a distinct personality to it. This version is just another bottom-of-the-barrel act of desperation by Disney to make money off of stupid people's nostalgia with a quote-unquote live-action update of one of their older movies that was already perfectly fine the way it was. All of the characters' personalities are completely removed, the additional subplots and characters contribute nothing, the changes to the story make it worse, the lesson about lying is undercut and made into a joke. It's extremely hypocritical with things like Stromboli's assistant planning an uprising against her abusive boss coming from a company that treats its employees like shit. It sabotages the themes of the original by making Pinocchio a flawless scary stew. It removes so many things that were important to the original story, and all of its creative liberties subtract from the value of the original tale and misrepresent what the story is supposed to be about. When a Disney live-action remake messes up that badly, chances are it's gonna be a top contender for being at the bottom of the list. Only outdoing The Lion King 2019 because of the slightest hint of effort in trying to be its own thing separate from the original. Pinocchio 2022 is a terrible, awful movie, and an even worse reimagining of a beloved animated classic, and I demand that you stay away from it at all costs. Never, ever watch this movie, not even out of curiosity, because I promise you that it'll be a terrible waste of your time that you will never get back.
You will never bring your family honor!
Boy, oh boy, are we in for some serious ripping into now. While it may not be the absolute worst of the bunch, I don't think there's a Disney live-action remake yet that's as universally despised as Mulan 2020. Putting aside the controversy surrounding the lead actress being a scumbag who supports China's corrupt law enforcement, or Disney filming it on the site of literal concentration camps, which, yeah, those 2 things alone are more than enough to warrant this being placed near the bottom of the list. This movie just sucks. Like, it absolutely sucks. It's on par with Pinocchio 2022 in terms of not giving a fuck and properly representing the source material. And even putting that aside, it's just a terrible product in general. It offers literally nothing that was good about the original, to the point that as far as I know, Blaze the movie fan, yes, that Blaze the movie fan, is the only human being who's fucking retarded enough to actually believe that it's a film of quality. This movie more than deserves every single atom of negative reception it got because there's really a seemingly infinite number of things wrong with it. And let's start with the biggest sin of them all, turning Mulan into a Mary Sue.
Yeah, stop calling female characters you don't like Mary Sues. You're just a raging sexist who hates strong, independent women.
The original Mulan was a deeply complex and amazingly written character. She stood out from everyone around her because she didn't care about honor and serving her country. She joined the military to protect her father after he was seriously injured in a previous war. And she didn't knowing the risk of being put to death for dishonoring her family and the military. She also felt pressured by what society expected of her and wanted to prove her self-worth as an outcast. She had to go through a lot of training before developing her skills as a warrior, and she never gave up on herself even when everyone else did, demonstrating a really strong sense of fortitude in her spirit. Her character arc wasn't about changing anyone's perspective on women or proving they're just as capable as men. Her character arc was discovering her own self-worth and learning to develop courage and heart to protect her family and friends. To this day, she still remains one of the all-time great Disney protagonists for her selflessness, experiences, struggles, her relationships with the people around her, and her undying devotion to her family. But of course, Disney wanted to make this version of Mulan more serious and in tune with traditional Chinese values to appease the Chinese government, and in doing so, they stripped the remake version of everything that made the original a profound character. First off, she's a Mary Sue. Like, there's no way around this problem. The movie literally opens with her performing a shit ton of incredible feats and explaining how she was born with a shitload of chi or something like that. Now she doesn't have to actually train to become a skilled warrior. It just falls into her lap. She easily defeats her fellow soldiers during training, she easily defeats all the bad guys, she never struggles during any fight sequences. What's the point of making her train with the rest of the army if she doesn't need it? It's just a waste of screen time. And they also made her uncharacteristically patriotic, talking about how it's her duty to fight for her country when that wasn't important to her. She didn't join the army to fight for her country, she did it to protect her father. Instead of being a devoted daughter who wanted to impress and protect her family, now she's just a generic fight for my country soldier, which isn't nearly as compelling of a motivation. I guess she still does have something of a character arc, which is more than I can say for Pinocchio, but the remake just sucks all the fun out of it for the sake of being more traditional. And now her character arc is boring. She no longer succeeds through using her smarts to come up with solutions or improving her abilities. Now she just has acrobatic superpowers. That's not relatable in the least. The original Mulan was relatable because she didn't have superpowers and actually had to do stuff. Remake Mulan is a Kathleen Kennedy self-insert, just nothing but force-fed female empowerment. This is an unforgivable sin for the remake to make because it kills the theme of the movie and tarnishes the best character from the original story. But honestly, I'm talking about stuff that everyone with half a brain can figure out. Putting aside how dirty they did Mulan, the movie is still garbage. The acting is so bad. Like, all of it is just god-awful. The facial expressions, body language, and line deliveries are all so painfully dull. They're wooden, pale, stiff, and that's unforgivable when the characters in the original were full of expression and charisma. A lot of people complain about the removal of the songs, and I understand why people are upset by that, but I'm personally capable of forgiving the removal of the songs. Like, if you told me that the Lion King 2019's rendition of Be Prepared was just gonna be Scar belching and yawning the lyrics of the songs with none of the mesmerizing visuals and colors, I would have preferred it to not be in the movie at all. I would have been completely okay with the songs being removed if they stayed faithful to the original story, and Mulan 2020 completely annihilates it in more ways than one. Not only is the pacing off because of all the pointless filler and new subplots and characters they threw in, but they also removed so many characters that were crucial to the original. They removed Mulan's grandma for no apparent reason even though she was one of the most entertainingly funny characters. They got rid of Shang because apparently they didn't want Mulan to be in a commander-subordinate relationship because of that bullshit Me Too movement. They replaced Shan Yu, a heavily underrated Disney villain might I add, with a boring-as-hell one-dimensional Jason Scott Lee. Yao Ling and Chin Po are replaced with these annoying stooges. They even got rid of the Chancellor guy. Like, why did you have to remove him? I liked that guy. He was a fun source of comedy, being a pathetic social climber and a punching bag for the other characters while acting as a foil to Mulan. But I think the worst removal of all has to be Mushu in favor of this quote-unquote more realistic Phoenix. What was the point of replacing Mushu if his replacement was just gonna be a terrible CGI non-entity? The Phoenix is supposed to act as Mulan's guardian, but it doesn't do jack shit throughout the entire movie. It never does anything to help Mulan throughout her journey, and it barely appears at all. Mushu was an actual character in the original. He was an actual companion who helped Mulan and developed a relationship with her. He had his own character arc about trying to prove himself as a guardian of the family and being accepted by the ancestors. The Phoenix is just a set piece to stall the movie's runtime. It serves no purpose whatsoever. Was it worth removing all these characters and replacing them with more authentic and faithful to Chinese culture ones? No, because every character in this movie is a boring plank of wood. None of them have anything resembling a personality. None of them do anything significant to suggest their character traits. They're just there, following the script without injecting any charm or individuality to their roles. They try to introduce this new character who acts as a secondary antagonist and a rival for Mulan, but even she doesn't do anything interesting. They try to give her a sad backstory to make her complex, but they never expand on it. They just briefly mention it without showing anything that happened. And they also try to do that stupid thing where the villain tries to rehabilitate the hero by saying they're the same, but it has no effect on Mulan whatsoever. Not even a moment of hesitation. It's just there for the sake of adding that stupid cliché. And she also sacrifices herself to save Mulan during the final battle for pretty much no reason. There's no development in her turnaround or when she started developing admiration for Mulan. It's a last-minute redemption with no believable transition. I also find it hilarious that the filmmakers wouldn't shut up about wanting to make this movie more traditional and realistic to appease the Chinese audiences, and then they gave her magic powers like teleportation and shape-shifting. So you removed Mushu and other fantasy elements from the animated version because you thought they weren't faithful to the original ballad, but a sorcerer who shapeshifts into birds is supposed to be the realistic version? What a fucking load. They also ruined so many iconic moments from the original, like Mulan suiting up in the avalanche. The original version of Mulan suiting up for battle was epic and bittersweet, showing how she was making the ultimate sacrifice, putting her life on the line to protect her father. It's a striking montage with her leaving her family behind, cutting her hair symbolizing her transformation into a more confident person, emotionally captivating music, and it took place during a rainy night to establish the tension and danger of her choice. The remake just skips over the montage and shows her in the armor, and the family doesn't even find out she's gone until they wake up the next morning. They don't even have an emotional reaction to her leaving. This was supposed to be the emotional turning point of the story, the scene that pumped you up for the second act, and they just got rid of it entirely. Then you have the avalanche. The original demonstrated Mulan's courage and ability to think up strategies in the heat of battle. She used her problem-solving skills and put her life at risk to make the snow fall on the Huns. In the remake, the bad guys are tricked into starting the avalanche themselves. Not only does this make the villains look like incompetent morons, it also stripped Mulan of her personality traits as a strategist. They even managed to ruin the scene where they discover the destroyed village and the massacred army. The original had subtle build-up to this moment using the juxtaposition of a cheerful song before suddenly catching you off guard with the sight of a destroyed village. It left everyone in shock and showed the threat that the Huns were capable of. You see how horrified the other characters are, and there's virtually no dialogue allowing the imagery to sink in. In the remake, they just dump in a bunch of garbage exposition on the audience. There isn't even any build-up to it. They just randomly cut to it like Mulan's armor. The remake doesn't bother taking any time to properly establish a tone, resulting in all these scenes being empty and devoid of meaning. Speaking of tone, another mistake the remake makes is its inability to balance itself. Mulan was a war movie containing dark elements, but they had to do something to even the tone for a family audience. The original did this very well using its song numbers, cast of characters with colorful personalities, and the character-focused narrative while spacing everything out properly. There was a proper mood being set throughout the movie, so the lighthearted moments didn't feel inappropriate when paired with the darker scenes. But because the remake is trying to have a more serious tone, the entire movie just feels gloomy and less fun to sit through. There's no lighthearted moments easing the tension between more serious scenes, resulting in the movie being devoid of personality. It's just a boring war movie with no unique identity. They removed so many things from the original in an attempt to make the remake more mature, but they don't actually do anything to make the story more mature. It's mostly the same thing, but with more ridiculous and childish stuff like chi superpowers and shape-shifting sorcerers, and incompetent villains who team kill their own soldiers. If anything, this is a more kiddie version of Mulan than the actual cartoon, and that one had Eddie Murphy in it. And not to mention the many things that make no sense. Why are there no consequences for Mulan having chi if it's supposed to be a bad thing? They briefly show her being shunned by the village and nothing comes of it. Why is Mulan going through the matchmaker ceremony if they already found her a suitor? Why does no one in the army question Mulan's combat mastery or how she almost killed one of her fellow soldiers? Why does Mulan get rid of her armor? It's supposed to be a family heirloom, but she just discards it for no reason. And why do they only exile Mulan instead of putting her up for execution if she disgraced the army? It completely kills the danger Mulan was supposed to be in by putting herself in that situation. There's no tension for Mulan's life and the scene is just rushed beyond belief. I got pages of these, I can go on. But quite possibly the most awful thing about this movie, and that's saying a lot, is the atrocious, abominable editing. I want to say that the fight scenes and action sequences are good for their use of traditional Chinese martial arts, but you never get to appreciate any of it because of how horrifically choppy the cinematography is. Aside from the overuse of slow motion, the movie is constantly jumping all over the place between different camera angles and shots. It's like those horrible movie trailers where the shots aren't even a second long before immediately cutting to something else back to back, except it's actually in the movie. They never commit to just holding on to a shot to let you appreciate the atmosphere of the action scenes. It's just horrible jump cut after horrible jump cut, rushing through a bunch of frames before you can even process what's happening. The super fast rate in which they go through these shots makes the entire film an ADHD nightmare to sit through. I can't think of a single moment where the camera is allowed to just breathe or take a break. Not a single establishing shot or a frame that lets you sink in the fight choreography. It's an epileptic disaster. There's certainly a lot of other things I can touch upon, like the buttload of historical inaccuracies or the many ways they get Chinese culture wrong, which just makes the filmmakers even more hypocritical, as the entire point of making this live action was to make it more historically and culturally accurate. But we got 15 more of these movies to get through, and I really don't want to end up behind schedule. The message of the original Mulan was that anyone can be a hero if they work for it. The remake's message is you have to be born special to be a hero. It completely destroys the relatability of both the story and the character. Mulan 2020 is just an awful movie overall, completely devoid of any rewatch value. Like, if it wasn't for those controversies I mentioned in the beginning, I don't think anyone would have given this trash a passing glance. Unless they're a retard like Blaze the movie fan. Just do yourself a favor and stay as far away from this horseshit as possible. Never give it your time of day and just watch Rush Hour, because I promise you that movie does far more justice for the Chinese people than this.
Wendy? Wendy!
Peter Pan and Wendy may as well just be called Wendy because the lengths they go to make this Peter Pan movie about her over Peter fucking Pan is insane. And that's only the worst of it when it comes to the girl bossing in this movie. I don't care if I get any comments accusing me of being a sexist who just hates strong, active female characters. This movie is awful, and one of the biggest reasons for that is how it shoves female empowerment down your throat. There is actually a scene that force feeds a bunch of exposition to the audience that Peter has to get help from girls to save the day, and how he's a brat for trying to take the credit. It's like a satire of female empowerment, and yet they play it completely straight. And who else but Wendy to give us such a horrible speech? Wendy in this movie is an atrocity of a character. They completely removed all the things that made her unique and charming and just replaced it with Mary Sue energy. She's introduced as a sword fighter like her brothers because, yeah, we have to make her a badass sword fighter instead of a soft motherly figure who shared stories with them. She doesn't need Peter Pan to save her because she saves herself. All she has to do is think happy thoughts and she's fighting and flying and saving the day by herself. And all those happy thoughts? Why, they're not about her spending time with family and loved ones. No, they're about all the girl boss things she's gonna do when she grows up. Because we need to make her take action and make her so awesome on her own that she doesn't need anybody else. Hell, she's arguably a better sword fighter than Peter. Yeah, we're supposed to believe she's a master sword fighter because that stupid play session in the beginning was a Chekhov's gun. Heck, she saves Peter multiple times during the climax because that's what girl boss Wendy does. When I said this movie may as well just be called Wendy, I wasn't kidding. Peter spends the entire movie playing second fiddle to her to the point that he's no longer the focus of his own story. That's all Wendy does. She just girl bosses over everything. Oh wait, that's not all she does. She's also a disrespectful little shit. She breaks the mirror during the play session and takes no responsibility for it, instead throwing her brothers under the bus, and then proceeds to act rude towards her mother by saying she doesn't want her life. This is our introduction to this turd that's supposed to make us like her, but it just makes us hate her. And later in the movie she assaults Peter for saving her brothers from getting killed by the pirates? What was the point of that? She orders him around, looks down on him, reprimands him for doing literally nothing, and acts like it's his fault that pirates are attacking them. She's supposed to be the most mature and well-mannered character in the story, and yet she acts extremely entitled and childish towards everyone. She's just a one-dimensional brat throughout the whole thing. Wendy in the original was more interesting because she wasn't a one-dimensional girl boss. She was an actual character. She was nurturing and compassionate and provided stability to the people around her. She also struggled with the idea of growing up like her brothers did, leaving childhood behind and facing adulthood. But over time she learns that it's nothing to be scared of and something that everyone has to deal with. It's a natural part of life and we should be ready for it. She helps her brothers remember the things they left behind at home and taught them that it's okay to get older as long as you stay in touch with your family, which fits the movie's message about how growing up is a natural part of life. She represented growth and maturity and the positive aspects of entering adulthood. She was an amazing role model for children and even young women to aspire to. But fuck that noise, we have to make Remake Wendy a no-nonsense warrior who treats people like shit, and acts superior and rescues herself because it makes her more badass and independent. Fuck me, they even went so far as to completely cut out Your Mother and Mine. That was an amazing song for the story they were telling with the characters. It's a song that teaches us about the importance of family we tend to overlook in our adolescence. It teaches us about strength and support that loving parents can give to us. It's what motivated John and Michael to return home. It was practically the emotional highlight of the original. But fuck that nurturing and kind-hearted song that teaches us about the importance of growing up. We have to keep this version of Wendy an independent girl boss who doesn't want to be a mom. So she just sings them a shitty lullaby. Fuck you, Bob Iger. Fuck you. And the worst part about this whole thing is that because her role in the movie is so badly inflated, most of the other characters don't get to do anything. The Lost Boys, the Lost Gender Neutrals, are hardly in the movie, so they might as well have been cut for all they get to do. John and Michael are just there to be kidnapped all the time. Smee is demoted to just being a random background character on Hook's ship. Even Tiger Lily, as much as they try to make her more important to the plot, is hardly in it. She shows up a total of twice. Once to give Wendy some dumb spiritual advice, and again in the climax to help Peter fight the pirates after she saved him from something he shouldn't have come back from. Oh, don't you worry, we'll get to that bullshit soon enough. They even had to make her a girl boss. They change it so that she's leading the Lost Gender Neutrals alongside Peter, they make her just as skilled of a fighter as Wendy for no reason, and they make her commanding and assertive like she always knows what to do. She's not even a unique character. She's just a clone of Wendy. Oh, and don't forget how badly they messed up Tinkerbell, removing all the things that made her character iconic and just turned her into a prissy nice girl. They took out the tense relationship she had with Wendy for Peter's affection because, oh dear, that would portray a female character in a negative light. And we can't have that in Peter Pan and Wendy, can we? They removed her energetic temper and they removed her jealousy, which were vastly important to her character. It was part of her redemption arc where she risked her life to save Peter and warn him about Wendy and the others getting kidnapped. She went through actual growth and development as a character. But in the remake, they took all of that away from her and just made her a bland and boring stereotypical polite token character. And she doesn't even do anything. She just sprays pixie dust on a few people and that's it. She has no presence in the story and no personality to the point that getting blackwashed is her only character trait. And as for Peter Pan, he might as well be the villain of the movie because of how badly they butchered him. Peter Pan in the original was full of personality. He was witty, humorous, snarky, courageous. He laughed in the face of danger, and he was always acting cheerful throughout the film. Sure, he was immature and thoughtless, but he was supposed to be those things. He personified the mindset of not growing up that Neverland represented. It's what made him a beloved hero. He had a colorful personality and made the movie fun to watch with his whimsical outlook on life. But in the remake, Peter Pan is made into a mopey, depressed, unenthusiastic, monotone, pitiful stick in the mud. He's no longer whimsical or charismatic like he was in the original. He's just some kid dressed up in leaves. Seriously, this is not in any way Peter Pan. How did you stupid fucks look at this character in the original and come up with this? Did you just decide that Peter needs to be stripped of all of his iconic personality traits and turned into this miserable, emotionally fragile stick in the mud? Like, remember how brave and egotistical he was during his fights with Hook? How those elements of his character added charm and experience to their battles? Now he just doesn't do that. In one of his confrontations with Hook, he's all intimidated and fragile, like he hasn't outwitted this guy multiple times. But even worse is how they made him into such an unlikable prick. There's this new subplot where he and Hook used to be best friends until Hook started missing his parents and wanted to return home. So Peter banished him from Neverland. He then cuts off his hand when he returns, which just makes this version look sadistic if they were supposed to be best friends. And then he's completely dishonest with Wendy by not actually explaining what happened. He just tells her how he came back evil and never brings up how he banished him with no way of getting back to his parents. And this just makes Peter look like a huge hypocrite since at the end of the movie it's revealed that he missed his mom, and that's why he kept coming back to Wendy's house, which just happens to be the same house that he grew up in.
What a twist!
So basically he abandoned his mom and most likely scarred her for life over being told what to do, but ends up missing her anyway and then has the audacity to be mad at Hook for missing his family. What a humongous asshole. Peter Pan is the titular character, the hero we're supposed to root for, and in this version of the story, he's a piece of shit. And speaking of his dynamic with Hook, oh man, they really did his character dirty. Hook in the original was a theatrical and commanding villain. He was full of comedic energy and conniving personality. He was funny, but also a legitimate threat like Eggman in the Sonic movies. He had nefarious schemes and was strategic and cunning, which made him unpredictable. But he was also a pathetic weasel who begs for mercy just to stab you when your back is turned. And his chemistry with Smee was a goldmine of comedy. The ways they worked off each other were filled with raw energy and perfect timing. They were the show stealers every time they were on screen. They were practically the best part of the original movie, and Disney felt the need to replace that with stupid melodrama because they wanted to humanize the villain again. He's no longer funny and humorous. They completely removed his comedic moments that were the highlight of the original. He's not a sharp foil to Peter anymore, and his energy and bravado are gone. He's just as much of a stick in the mud as Peter, completely bland and boring. They didn't even have the decency to maintain the scenes with a crocodile. The crocodile appears for like 3 minutes in one scene and then never appears again for the rest of the movie. What a ripoff. And aside from the characters being horribly written, they're also horribly acted. There's no sense of energy or charisma to the performances whatsoever. None of them look like they're having a good time in a fucking Peter Pan movie. Even during the scenes when they delve into Hook's backstory and try to humanize him, they never express the emotions they should be feeling. They just sound bored while staring into the abyss. But perhaps the most atrocious thing about this remake, outside of how horrible the characters are, is how thoroughly they butchered Neverland. Neverland is supposed to be this colorful, magical place filled with fantasy and enchantment. It was the embodiment of childlike imagination, a whimsical fantasy world of pirates and mermaids and jungles. It made you believe that the Lost Boys would rather live here than go home and grow up with so many opportunities for adventure waiting to be discovered. You wanna know how it looks like in the remake? It looks like a colorless shithole. Neverland in this movie is dull, desaturated, devoid of any sort of variety, and it doesn't look anything like a fantasy setting. It just looks like some mountainsides in New Zealand. How are we supposed to pick up that Neverland is some sort of magical enchanted place when there's nothing special about it? The horrible introduction shot pretty much says it all. Like, this is how they introduce Neverland in this movie. How is that Neverland? It just looks like a boulder in the middle of nowhere. It literally looks like a stock photo of a rock that someone took from Google and made no effort to adjust the contrast or the lighting. The introduction shot of Neverland in the original was leagues above this. It presented Neverland as a magical fantasy setting, something that looks like it existed outside of our reality. It was a beautiful exotic painting that filled you with a sense of anticipation, that you were in for a huge adventure. But now, thanks to the remake, all of that is gone. From the moment we're introduced to Neverland to the moment we leave, there's no sense of personality or enchantment. It doesn't have any of the inviting visuals the original had, and it doesn't even have any sense of color. It's just a random, badly contrasted place surrounded by water. How do you fuck this up? How do you take Neverland, freaking Neverland, one of the most colorful, vibrant, and imaginative settings in a Disney film? How do you take that and make it look this dull and monotonous? And honestly, the more you think about it, it's not just Neverland. The entire movie is like this. Every single second of this movie looks like it was shot in someone's bathroom. Everything is devoid of color and the lighting effects are so atrocious that you can hardly make anything out. You have to maximize the brightness on your screen in order to even see anything that's happening. It just looks so dark and unsaturated. And it's really harmful to the eyes because you're practically flexing every muscle on your face just to squint and see what's going on in this movie. Seriously, take a still shot from this movie and compare it to a still shot of any other film adaptation of Peter Pan. The difference in color and contrast is overwhelmingly jarring. Why did the filmmakers think this was acceptable? Why did they feel the need to take out the visual appeal in a medium that's supposed to be visual? Even Captain Hook's ship, a vibrant vessel where you can make out different colors and effects, has none of the color and personality that was present in the original. So not only is this movie horribly written, it's also painful to look at. And that's before we factor in the god-awful CGI and low-budget green screen effects. And then there's the plot holes. So many horrible plot holes. In the original, our heroes made an effort to dodge Hook's cannon fire. Peter even used himself as a decoy while the others escaped. In the remake, they get hit by the cannon fire immediately, and in extremely close proximity, might I add. Look at this. This shit should have killed them outright, but then they're seen to have survived it without even a scratch. The debris from the rock alone should have killed them. It's a simple scientific fact. If you want the cannon fire to hit them like this, they shouldn't be alive anymore. And unlike the original where Hook used his cunning and deceit to trick Tinkerbell into getting the location of the hideout, here he just randomly finds it while aimlessly wandering the forest because of Wendy's singing. If he's been here before, shouldn't he know the location beforehand? Why didn't he just go there and capture everyone from the start? And then in the climax, we find out that the ability to fly can just be transferred to someone by sharing their pixie dust. If the ability to fly can be transferred at any time by sharing your pixie dust with someone, why didn't they do this earlier? You'd think that would have been a useful ability for them to use earlier, especially when you're being chased by pirates who want to murder you. But the biggest load of shit of all is how Peter survived that nonsense he shouldn't have survived. So Peter faces off against Hook in the hideout and gets slashed in the chest. Then he falls over 100 feet down and crashes on the ground with nothing to cushion the impact of the fall. So his shadow detaches from his body and gets Tiger Lily for help. And then she uses some sort of magic herb to seal his wound. And apparently that's all it takes for Peter to come back from that. Never mind the fact that his bones were crushed and his organs were ruptured from the fall. All he needed was someone to patch up that cut on his chest and he's good to go. And what follows is one of the most asinine answers I have ever heard for a character coming back from the dead. I am really not kidding, it's almost as bad as somehow Palpatine returned.
No pixie dust this time. No magic. No tricks. Just a little help from my friends.
What is this shit?
Really? That's the answer you want to go with? The power of friendship brought you back from getting slashed in the chest, blood loss, falling from over 100 feet, and all of your bones and organs getting crushed upon impact with the ground. This is some next level bullshit. Peter, what friends are you even talking about? Because as far as I know, you hardly interacted with any of your friends in this movie. The only one of your friends that you regularly interacted with is Wendy, and she treats you like garbage. How did you get help from your friends when you have no friends from what we've been led to believe about you? Like, couldn't you have at least said that there were magic in those herbs that Tiger Lily used to heal you? That's the only logical explanation for how you could have survived all this. But no, you want to boil it down to a stupid shonen anime. Get the fuck out of here with that nonsense. Holy shit, this movie was a hard one to sit through. Words cannot describe how badly I wanted to punch the director of this one in the face. It was just so painful and infuriating. Like, it may not be the worst of these remakes. There's certainly more offensive examples of butchering the characters and source material, but I personally just hate this one so much. Everything that made Peter Pan a beloved children's story is thoroughly neutered in this movie, removing the passionate creativity, witty humor, and timeless wonder for this painfully unoriginal and dated female empowerment nonsense. The characters are sterilized, the atmosphere is dull and ugly, the colors are faded and watered out, the pacing is horrible, and the special effects are fucking abysmal, which is inexcusable for the amount of money this company has in its wallet. It adds nothing new to the original story except shoving girl power down your throat and following a horrible trend of adding revisionism to the plot, just to make the villain look like a tragic figure while painting the hero as a horrible person. Even if you're just watching this without any knowledge of the other Peter Pan movies and just want to see this as some sort of original pirate fantasy movie, it's still terrible because of how boring the world is and how badly written the characters are. Wendy is a spoiled brat throughout the story, which is horrible given how badly the film is portraying her as a positive role model. Tiger Lily and Black Tinkerbell are only here as part of Disney's attempt to convince you how not racist they are. Side characters like John, Michael, the Lost Gender Neutrals, and Smee do practically nothing. Peter Pan is a thoroughly loathsome person. By the end of this shit show, you'll be rooting for Hope to win, which isn't even satisfying because he's the one who gets screwed over. The original Peter Pan was a lively and bombastic movie that gave you a sense of childhood wonder and innocence. It was a welcoming and joyful experience, even if it was a bit racist. Peter Pan and Wendy is a miserable, dull experience with terrible melodrama that tries way too hard to be taken seriously. It thoroughly butchers the original story's message about the importance of maturity and growing up, and it's so hard to even watch because of how horrible and faded the visuals are. Just take my word for it and never watch this abhorrent pile of shit for as long as you live. Just watch the original Peter Pan and pretend it doesn't exist. Let the memory of it die along with every bit of childhood wonder I lost from sitting through it.
You know how I got these scars?
Cause singing killed my grandma, okay?
Hey guys, you know that crazy lady who wants to butcher innocent baby animals and just turn their skin into a fur coat for her to wear? Let's make a movie humanizing her. Yeah, I don't know who at Disney thought this was a good idea for a prequel, but whoever they are needs to be fired. Out of a cannon. Into the mouth of an erupting volcano. This was Disney's attempt at giving Cruella de Vil an origin story as part of their newest trend to try and humanize the villains of their animated films, something that arguably began with 2014's Maleficent. And while I'm not entirely against the idea on a conceptual level, the way Disney does it is extremely terrible. They try to direct sympathy and feel sorry for me vibes to some of the most despicable villains in their movies when that's not what people liked about them at all. So many of these villains are loved specifically because of their traditional structure of being evil for the sake of being evil. The days of yore when a villain could just be an asshole who wants power and world domination before things like Steven Universe, Naruto, Disney, Star Wars, and the MCU came up with elaborate backstories in an attempt to make you feel sorry for the genocidal mass-murdering sociopaths. The main problem is that Disney uses these backstories to try and add complexity to them when it just takes away from what made them entertaining and iconic. Instead of just using these backstories to explain their actions, they have to go out of their way to try and make you sympathize with them. And Cruella is probably the worst one so far. Even with the idea this could just be an alternate universe take on the character, they're clearly not taking inspiration from the source material and just making shit up as they go along. Like seriously, when I first found out that the setup for Cruella's villain arc was seeing her adopted mom get killed by Dalmatians for no reason and then having the film take this turn of events 100% seriously, all I could think about was this. It's not even a believable catalyst for her mental breakdown with how the movie frames it. The way the movie tries to portray this as a form of growing bipolar disorder and schizophrenia schizophrenia is completely exaggerated, and they actually believe this is an accurate depiction of how mental disorders work. It's actually really dishonest and offensive to people who actually struggle with these issues. And it's made even worse with the absolutely asinine twist that the woman who had her mom killed was her actual mom the whole time, and that her mental disorders are hereditary. Putting aside how offensive and dishonest that is, like, I shouldn't have to explain to you that's not how bipolar disorder and schizophrenia works. It completely annihilates the origin story they were going for. So now you want us to believe that Cruella is going to grow up to be an animal killer because her biological mother ordered the execution of her infant child just to keep the inheritance money from her husband. What M. Night Shyamalan nonsense is this? How did you even come to that conclusion? How does that even translate to the character of Cruella de Vil? I became a psychotic fashionetta who wants to kill animals because my mom tried to kill me as a baby? That is so ludicrous. This alone was enough for me to write this off as one of the top 5 worst of these live-action remakes. And we're not even half done. Like, I could understand the idea of this being an alternate version of Cruella if she was anything like Cruella. And that's the most annoying thing about Emma Stone in this movie. She never gets the character down right. They're clearly trying to make this version a mix-up between the original one and this new, more tragic one, but there's nothing engaging about the acting or writing. Emma's performance is dull, boring, and monotone. She never captures the zaniness the character is recognized for. She always comes across as restricted and inert. There's practically no contrast between her Cruella persona and her regular one. She just acts preserved throughout most of her performance. Cruella was an iconic villain for how much she stood out from a crowd. She was an insane megalomaniac who projected her ego on everyone. She was really humorous in her deranged schemes involving skinning animals for her own gain, being malicious and psychotic in a way where she never even makes an attempt to hide it. She knows she's nuts and relishes in every single moment of it. This version of Cruella is trying to be more sophisticated and stylish for the sake of adding complexity to her character, but she never acts off of it. And not to mention how they get the character wrong in so many different ways throughout the movie. Like, she gets the idea of having a villain laugh from watching it on TV. What kind of bullshit is that? She needed a TV show to help her develop a villain laugh? She couldn't come up with it on her own? She's supposed to be psychotic and all that does is make her less psychotic. And that's just one example. So many of her traits are just her imitating what she saw from someone else. They even have to make it so her calling people imbeciles was hereditary from her mom. The movie never makes an attempt to show us her traits through subtlety. They have to be explained to us through ham-fisted dialogue and exposition. Everything about this version of the character is just unfascinating and derivative of any charisma, or at least something that would allow us to associate this character with Cruella. I guess they were trying to make her more reserved and mysterious for the origin story they were going for, but that's not who Cruella was. Cruella de Vil wasn't a mystery. She was just a lunatic who was obsessed with wearing animal hides, and she would stop at nothing to get the most fashionable clothing made of animals. All I could think of throughout the movie was how they were trying to avoid drawing parallels to another actress who played this character in the past, so they tried to make her more sophisticated and mysterious only to fail at making her entertaining. And if by some chance you know which movie I'm talking about, you've probably already figured out it's not exactly a favorable comparison. But even with how badly this origin story gets Cruella wrong, it also gets other characters from 101 Dalmatians wrong. They had to give us a pointless mid-credit sequence showing how Cruella gave Pongo and Perdita to Roger and Anita as puppies just so some morons in the audience can be like, oh, so that's how it happened. Have you guys really never heard of a pet store or an animal shelter? You never thought that maybe they got the dogs that way without any involvement from Cruella for the sake of pointlessly trying to tie her into the backstory of the main characters from the original movie? They even had to change it so that Roger got the inspiration for writing the Cruella de Vil song from her donating a puppy to him. Why would Roger write a song about how horrible Cruella is after donating a puppy to him? That makes no sense. He wrote the song because of her bad vibes and her malicious attitude. That's why the lyrics are the way they are. Oh no, she gave me a dog. She's an inhuman beast who ought to be locked up and never released. Seriously, there's so many horrific references to the original movie that they threw in just to have them there. They don't care if it contradicts the story they're currently telling as long as they just reference the original. Good God. The way they throw in Horace and Jasper is terrible too. They made it so they all met up as kids and then miraculously reunite years later when they get older, specifically so they can help her with her convoluted revenge plot. Now it no longer makes sense for her to be mean and nasty to them in the original because this movie portrays them as friends. Nor does it make sense that Horace and Jasper would want to kill animals because they're characterized as kind-hearted people. The movie's use of pop songs is also extremely annoying. They're constantly throwing these songs into the movie for no reason, even when they don't fit what's happening in a scene. It's like in the Super Mario Bros. Movie where they just played Take On Me for no reason. Seriously, who was taking on who during that scene? But at least the Mario movie only had like 3 or 4 of these pop songs. Cruella has over 30 of them. Isn't that self-defeating for Disney, as their main goal is to make as much money as possible while spending as little as possible? Why would you piss away money just to have all these songs in the movie if you do nothing with them? They just play for like half a minute and then disappear without serving any purpose. It feels like this movie is trying to be some sort of musical without having any real musical sequences in it. It's just tone deaf and ruins the mood of the story. And speaking of the story, it too is completely horrible. So much of its runtime is just watching Cruella trolling her mom as part of some nefarious revenge scheme. There's nothing else going on. And not to mention how horribly slow the pacing is on account of this movie being over 2 hours long. Yeah, you heard right. Cruella is over 2 hours long, making it the longest of these shitty remakes yet. I've criticized the runtime of these movies before, but this is insane. Did you really need 2 hours to give us an origin story for Cruella? She's crazy and wants to wear animal hides. That's all you need to know. But no, we had to throw in all this dumb revenge nonsense. It gets repetitive and old very quickly, and they don't even do anything to explore Cruella as a character. For a movie that's trying to be a prequel that ties Cruella into the original more, it never does anything to justify her obsession with Dalmatians. Sure, the Dalmatians pushed her adopted mom off a cliff, but the birth mom commanded them to do that. She shouldn't have any malice towards the dogs because they were trained to act at the behest of their owner. It's even a crucial plot point later that she abducts the Dalmatians the mom used to push the stepmom off a cliff, and she never does anything to them. She doesn't take revenge by using their skin for a coat. She just makes herself their new master. What made her decide she wants to skin Dalmatians for clothing? Where are the finer details to that backstory? You can't just say Dalmatians killed my mom and just expect us to go along with it. It makes no sense as a prequel because there's nothing logically tying it into the original. The setup is thoroughly convoluted and does nothing to properly fit into the established lore of the franchise. The acting is all over the place and the characters have all the fun sucked out of their personalities. And not to mention that stupid as hell ending where no one questions how they never found Estella's body, so they just decided to give everything to her disguised as Cruella, not knowing it's her just because it was in her will. That's not how inheriting stuff works. The original owner of all the stuff is still alive, so it's not like you can just auction everything and put it on sale. If I get arrested for pushing someone off a cliff, does that mean all my clothes and video games are going to be given to some random person to inherit everything when it's not legally theirs to inherit? I don't know, you guys. This one was just a complete mess to get through. Aside from just being a horrible attempt to humanize Cruella for the sake of tying her into the backstory of the original movie, it's just so boring and exhausting. It feels like a homework assignment you're forced to do even though you had to stay home from school because you got sick. Nothing about it is charming, memorable, funny, or even given its own unique identity. It's just there to remind you that 101 Dalmatians is a thing. And if you're a fan of the movie, you'll pay money to watch anything with a connection to the IP. Just do yourself a favor and watch 101 Dalmatian Street instead. It has everything this canine turd doesn't, and it's definitely more worthy of your time than this.
You knew I wanted them first! Because I got the hose? That's what you're mad about?
I will give Mufasa the following compliments over The Lion King 2019. The characters actually emote, and I will admit the facial expressions are good if a bit uncanny. They get the feelings of the characters across pretty well with things like sadness and fear and playfulness, which is a huge breath of fresh air over The Lion King 2019 where everyone just had the same stilted face the whole time. And the voice acting of the child characters is pretty good. There's a recognizable sense of enthusiasm in their voices compared to young Simba and Nala, with Kiara, young Mufasa, and young Scar providing a wider sense of range in their fluctuation. Honestly, if the movie was just about young Scar and young Mufasa going on some misadventures while searching for his missing family, it could have been interesting. Okay, now for all the reasons this movie is cat shit. This is the latest example of Disney coming up with elaborate backstories for their villains in an attempt to invoke sympathy for them. So how do you humanize a guy who killed his brother, framed his son for it, tried to have his son killed, and drove an ecosystem to ruin? Well, I'll tell you how. By not doing what this fucking movie does. I am so dumbfounded that they made up an entire prequel based on this dumbass throwaway line from The Lion King 2019.
Long ago, you chose Mufasa over me, but now there is a new king. So stop being so selfish.
Spoilers if you care about Mufasa the Lion King, which chances are you don't. While searching for Milele, which will eventually be known as the Pride Lands, Mufasa and Scar, or Taka as he was named before his villain arc, meet up with Sarabi. Taka is smitten by her and wants her to be his queen, asking Mufasa to help him out. He does some things to impress her with Mufasa's help until later in the movie when a stampede breaks out. Sarabi gets caught up in it and Mufasa goes in to save her. When she regains consciousness, Mufasa tells her Scar saved her, but later she confronts him about how he was the one who saved her. They sing a bland song, fall in love, and Taka sees the whole thing and gets heartbroken. So he decides to team up with the villains to overthrow Mufasa and take over the Pride Lands for himself.
Okay. I'm just gonna— What the
this?
Yeah, they basically turned Scar into an incel. Honestly, this is on par with Dalmatians Killed My Mom in terms of being so stupid that it's actually kinda funny. Like seriously, we're supposed to believe that Scar came up with this elaborate nefarious plan to kill Mufasa and steal the throne because he got friend-zoned. On one hand, it is kinda funny, but on the other hand, it ruins his character. This backstory just makes him look so pathetic and hateable, and not in a villain you love to hate kind of way. Now I just hate him for betraying his family for the pettiest reason you can imagine. Scar in the original didn't have an elaborate backstory for why he hated Mufasa. He just thought power was owed to him because he was next in the royal bloodline and took steps to steal the throne from his nephew. And it worked because it fit the tradition that Disney established at the time. Their antagonists were Saturday morning cartoon villains who just wanted money and power and to take over the world. And Scar in the original was infinitely entertaining and diabolical. He was sniveling and sinister, and it was so enjoyably disgusting how he manipulates Simba throughout the first act. He had an incredibly malevolent aura surrounding him, and he also had a humorous side to his personality. He behaved like an entitled diva with a dry ego, believing that because he was king he was above everyone around him. It was childish but also pretty disturbing given how much he managed to accomplish over the course of the movie. This stuff easily makes him top 5 material when it comes to ranking Disney villains. He was just so deliciously evil and egotistical throughout his screen time. But the backstory that he did all this because Mufasa got Sarabi over him just diminishes all those aspects of his character. He's no longer a snake-like schemer who concocted a plot to take over the Pride Lands out of a lust for power. Now he's just a petty bitch who never got over his crush. Ew, but Saeed, that's not the whole story. You're leaving out crucial information. Taka felt guilty about betraying Mufasa during the final battle and tried to set things right. He saved Mufasa's life again like he did in the beginning, but Mufasa was ungrateful to him. Scar is a tragic figure. It's Mufasa's fault for stealing his woman and having no gratitude for saving his life. Yeah, which wouldn't have happened in the first place if Scar didn't get pissed over being friend-zoned. Don't give me that villains are made garbage. This was a miserable attempt to add revisionism to the original story just for the sake of making Mufasa look like an asshole. The only thing it did to improve the story was make Scar's death more satisfying to watch. But okay, let's forget about the whole villain arc and how the movie set up Scar. Is it still any good? Oh fuck no, it's still garbage. It kinda serves as a prequel sequel by making the main plot into a story Rafiki tells Kiara to help her be more brave. It's not an inherently bad storytelling tool, but the movie does a horrific job framing it. It's constantly being broken up by Timon and Pumbaa being obnoxious little shits just so they can shove Seth Rogen and Billy Eichner down your throat. I'm serious, they never shut the fuck up. Every time one of them talks, I wanted to punch them in the face for intruding the story with their painfully unfunny commentary. It actively makes the movie worse because the filmmakers are telling the audience they have no faith in their attention span whatsoever. Instead of just letting you relax and see the story of Mufasa, they have to throw in a bunch of baby comedy with the comic relief being uptight and in your face. My guess is they were trying to recreate the color commentary from The Lion King 1.5. But the reason it worked there was because the movie was entirely about Timon and Pumbaa. It was the events of the story being told from their perspective, and the comedy came from their buddy-buddy dynamic while developing their characters. This is a story being told by Rafiki that doesn't include them at all. They probably weren't even born yet when all this stuff was happening, and even without them, the pacing is still painfully slow. There's more of those stupid scenes where they drag out the movie's runtime with nothing happening on screen just to flex how good the CGI is. The movie is almost 2 hours long with only 1 hour and 15 minutes of substance. It's just more stalling and padded filler to justify the longer runtime of the remakes compared to the originals. And the songs are extremely bland and sleep-inducing. I guess the vocal performances are fine, but the lyrics to these songs are so repetitive and uncreative. The rhythm behind them is wooden and they hardly do anything to further the story or the characters. They're just jukebox songs to pad out the story and soundtrack. They don't have any bombastic visuals or endearing soundtracks like the original Lion King had. It feels like they just put in songs because the original had songs, so this movie has to have songs too. And because of the way the story is structured, it's just all over the place. Eshe hastily adopts Mufasa as her adopted child because motherly instinct, I guess? They miraculously time jump before establishing a relationship between Mufasa and his adopted family. Mufasa makes zero attempt to find his way back home and just waits for the plot to tell him his family is at Milele. His adopted father, who ridiculed him throughout the first act, suddenly likes him just because he conveniently saved his wife. The adopted family is presumably dead because they just have it happen off screen. Rafiki randomly shows up with no proper introduction. We're just told that Mufasa's biological father died without actually showing anything that happened in the flood because again they do it off screen. And the climax is painfully rushed. Like these herbivore animals just met this predator 5 minutes ago and he somehow miraculously inspires them to join together and fight the bad guys. And the worst part of all is that we're supposed to believe that stupid cave-in is what caused the formation of Pride Rock. That doesn't make any fucking sense. Pride Rock was a large stone structure in the center of a wide open valley. It wasn't part of some underground cave. And if that's the case, what happened to that giant cliff? Or any of the land structure? It just disappears. Did you really have to retcon the geography of the Pride Lands just to answer a question no one asked? Oh gee, I wonder how Pride Rock was created. You stupid fucks. And not to mention, Scar's face heel realization comes out of literally nowhere. There's no build-up to it and no real reason for it if he was that butthurt over getting friend-zoned. It's not even impactful because he got his scar from the villain and not Mufasa as punishment for his betrayal. So now the scar on his eye is a symbol of self-sacrifice and risking his life to save Mufasa because the writers just wanted to make Mufasa look like an asshole. The ending is rushed in that Mufasa's mom just magically elects him king with no real objection from any of the animals. They barely do anything to establish a relationship with his biological parents, so the news of his dad dying is just an afterthought. And honestly, this just makes Mufasa look like a humongous dumbass. At this point in the timeline, he's completely aware of how deceitful Scar is and how quick he's willing to betray him. So how the fuck is he shocked or surprised by his betrayal in the main movie? Why would he ever put his trust in him? Why wouldn't he suspect him for having anything to do with that stampede in the gorge where Simba just happened to be at? Why would Mufasa ever allow himself to be caught off guard by Scar knowing about his past betrayal? It's a giant plot hole carried over to the original film, and it makes everything more convoluted. And the tie-ins they do into the original movie are complete horseshit. There's that stupid Pride Rock thing I mentioned before, the completely forced explanation they give for why everyone starts addressing Taka as Scar, the bare bones backstory for how the gang met up. Like, they even had to give us the origin of Rafiki's fucking stick. Like, the fucking stick's origin had to be explained to us. Are you serious? It's all just a dumb checklist the filmmakers went through to make this movie interconnect with the original. There's no natural choices made by the characters. It's all superficial because, well, it's a prequel and we have to do a bunch of references and tie-ins to the original because that's what prequels do. And it doesn't even make sense for Mufasa and Scar to be stepbrothers because it actively retcons things in the original story. Mufasa and Scar are directly stated to be biologically related. You can't just overwrite that. And remember that Great Kings of the Past scene? With Mufasa educating Simba about the past rulers and how they watch over them as a way to tell Simba that Mufasa will always be with him after he passes away? How does that align with this new backstory? What Great Kings of the Past are you talking about if Mufasa was the first one? They literally reference that scene in their stupid tribute to James Earl Jones at the beginning of the film. It's one of the most iconic scenes from the original, and they even had to retcon that, because Bob Iger is an absolute piece of shit. Even the characters are completely bland and forgettable. Mufasa is a bland underdog going on a by-the-numbers hero's journey, Sarabi is a bland love interest, Zazu is still annoying, the villain is completely forgettable, Rafiki is kinda just there to do some wisdom philosophy, and they don't do anything with Kiara to make her endearing. It just feels like she was thrown in there to foreshadow their plans to make a film franchise based on the direct-to-video sequels. Or worse, their plans to do a film series or some sort of Disney Plus series based on the Lion Guard by throwing in Kiara getting a little brother at the end. There's just nothing of value here. It's just another live-action adaptation of Disney's animated classics. And the sad part is, on a conceptual level it could have worked. It wasn't a remake of an already established animated movie. It's an origin story from the perspective of Mufasa and Scar when they were younger. This was an opportunity to do something unique or original. Something that could have been refreshing. But it's not refreshing. It's just boring and pale and faded. It completely tarnishes the character of Scar and doesn't do anything of value with the rest of the cast. It's an arbitrary cash grab and a badly written movie that does nothing except waste your time. Just do the same thing everyone else did and watch Sonic 3 instead.
Dumbo! 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 Dumbo!
Yeah, don't lie. You forgot this movie was even a thing, didn't you? Well, I wouldn't blame you because of the 4 live-action remakes that came out that year, Dumbo 2019 was the biggest flop. It's definitely the most unremarkable and forgettable of these remakes. It's actually so bland and forgettable that I was struggling to think of anything to say about it. I get that there wasn't much to work with because of how Dumbo is one of the more run-of-the-mill movies from Disney's earlier years, but if you can't come up with anything worthwhile with the source material, you might as well not even bother. You'd think that with a visionary like Tim Burton as the director, we would be in for something decent, but there's pretty much nothing visionary about this movie at all. With its terrible CGI, faded colors, personality-deprived characters, and unamusing plot, it is without a doubt the most soulless and uninspired movie in his professional career. They replaced Timothy Mouse with these 2 kids who are really bland and boring. They serve pretty much the same purpose as Timothy, so replacing him makes zero sense, especially if these kids are gonna be so deprived of personality. They have a father who's surprisingly chill and has no sign of PTSD despite having just returned from the war with a severed limb. Yeah, all that death and destruction and losing a whole body part is just a minor inconvenience for him. None of the three family members go through any satisfying character development, and they don't have any endearing chemistry with Dumbo. Like, they introduce the girl's interest in science and it never plays a role in the story. It's just an excuse to not give her a personality. But hey, at least they got rid of all the black racist stereotypes, right? Well, they did, but they replaced them with this gang of circus performers who happen to be their own racist stereotypes. Like, come on, there's no way these guys didn't end up turning a few heads. It also comes across as dishonest for them to remove these things, as if to say, oh, don't worry guys, the circus was never racist, and just replace it with a message about how animal cruelty is bad. Guys, this movie takes place in the early 1900s. No circus is going to be charitable and sacrifice profit for the sake of the sensibilities of animals and black people. It comes across as just as bad by acting like American circuses never had these problems at all. Systematic racism? Nah, America was squeaky clean and never persecuted people for their skin color. Tuh, where did you get an idea like that? And as for the animal cruelty thing, they really hammer that shit in. Like, there is no subtlety to the message at all. So much of the movie's runtime is dedicated to treating Dumbo and his mother horribly without actually forwarding the story in some shape or form. It's ham-fisted down your throat with no desire to let the audience use their brains to figure it out for themselves. And there's also so much obnoxious meta-commentary where Disney tries to come across as self-aware by criticizing the over-monetized nature of the circus. There's a lot of heavy-handed references to Disney theme parks in the movie, and there's even a scene where they're shown selling the actual Dumbo plushies. Like, the real Dumbo from the animated version. Remember that bullshit attitude Velma had where they were all like, ha, you can't criticize our offensively bad show because we're willing to poke fun at ourselves? Well, this was Disney's attempt at doing the same thing. We're supposed to not criticize them for being a money-grubbing company that wants to charge you bullshit amounts of money for their products because they did some meaningless self-aware commentary. Nice try, Bob, but you're still a shit stain. The pink elephant scene is also extremely unremarkable, cutting out the alcohol because again modern Disney is run by pussies, and is instead turned into a bubble show in the circus. Not only is it lazy and less creative with unremarkable visuals, but the CGI in the bubbles is so cringe. You'd think that Tim Burton of all people would have given us a faithful adaptation of the visual highlight of the original movie, but this is just so boring and uninspired. It doesn't have any of the colors and creative artistry the original had. It's just 2 minutes of a pinkish-purple backdrop. Some people might say the overall pacing is boggled down by the unentertaining shenanigans of the circus characters rather than developing the characters and the story, but what I find most surprising about this remake is how it's actually 2 movies rather than 1. The plot of the original, where Dumbo is born, joins the circus, gets bullied, gets separated from his mother, discovers his ability to fly, and reveals his ability to fly, becoming a worldwide sensation, all happen within 40 minutes of the movie's 104-minute runtime. The other 64 minutes are dedicated to this new storyline where they have to thwart this villain with the most backwards logic you can imagine in an attempt to exploit Dumbo. Where the hell did this malarkey come from? I've seen these remakes do crazy things to justify their longer runtime compared to the originals, but this takes it to a whole other level. Why did they make more than half the movie's runtime about this new storyline and wrap up the events of the original so quickly? The pacing of the first act is lightning fast and the rest of the movie is slow as molasses. And most of it is thanks to this circus tycoon who might just be the worst Disney villain I've ever seen. And that's saying a lot given his competition. He wants to exploit Dumbo's ability to fly for his own personal gain, but his logic throughout the movie is completely self-defeating. He abuses Dumbo's mom and even threatens to have her killed, but why does he do that? She doesn't do anything to threaten his business or interfere with his plans. They try to rationalize it because of this stupid investor who doesn't want to invest in a flying elephant. What is wrong with you? Why do you think no one would pay money to see a flying elephant, you stupid fuck? But back to the subject. Why does he think killing Dumbo's mom will benefit him at all? That would discourage Dumbo from flying because you would be emotionally and psychologically traumatizing him. Why doesn't he just release the mom? That would probably encourage Dumbo to keep doing the show as gratitude for freeing her. But no, he's just gonna kill his mom and do all these things that would actively discourage Dumbo from flying just because the movie needed a villain. This is on par with Tim allowing himself to be indoctrinated and believing he can control the Reapers in terms of brain rot villain writing. It doesn't do anything to improve the story and actively makes it worse. It all leads up to this stupid as hell climax where they come up with the most convoluted plan to release Dumbo's mom. Like, if I explained the details to you, you would think I was just making this up. And a rushed ending where the whole animal abuse thing is just magically resolved off screen and Dumbo and his mom are released into the wild. They don't even bother to address the legal battle that most likely took place after the destruction of property, people's lives being endangered, and an entire circus being set on fire. It's just we don't abuse animals anymore, and that's the end of it. Hey, what about all those animals in those cages that most likely died in that giant fire? Oh yeah, we don't abuse animals anymore. We just leave them to burn to death. Even the famous baby mine scene is incredibly dull and ineffective. They never develop the characters or their relationships up to this point in the story, so it's just a pointless part of the reference these things from the original checklist. Come on guys, do I even need to explain to you what makes this movie so bad? Aside from being a nothing burger adaptation of the original, the movie as a whole is just cold, lifeless, and boring, with the most backwards, horribly written villain I've ever seen in any of these movies. The conflict is forced, the characters are robotic planks, the visuals are mundane at best, and its attempt to be more politically correct by removing the original's racism towards black people just sends a lot of terrible messages with unfortunate implications. I really do wish I had more to say about it because it does feel like there's more that should be gone into, but there just isn't. It's just a nothing burger. I honestly think it's the most nothing movie out of all these remakes. With other entries on this list, I really had to think about how to evaluate them, and how I would rank them for this list. But Dumbo 2019 just provides you with nothing to think about. It's easily the most okay, I'll just put it here entry on the list, because it's so unremarkable that I feel like I could put it anywhere around the mid to end section of this list and it would feel appropriate. It's easily the most boring and unmemorable outing of all these remakes, which you'd think would be an impossibility with Tim Burton being the director. But as we'll see later on the list, I guess it's no surprise that this dickwad has all but lost his luster. This remake has no sense of wonder or awe or whimsy. It's just dour and pure boredom. Even as someone who thinks the original Dumbo is just okay for what it is, I can't deny that this is an insulting attempt to cash in on its likeness. Just do yourself a favor and never watch this movie. It's a shitty movie and a shitty remake, and it's also another reminder of why the circus and all of its freakiness should stay dead.
Remember the swamp? Remember my song in the swamp?
Shut up!
The Little Mermaid 2023 has Halle Bailey providing us with some pretty good singing, and pretty much nothing else of value. It completely sucks the life and joy out of the original, and Disney thinks we're supposed to give it a free pass because, hooray for helping black people feel better about themselves. Oops. The first and most glaring issue with the movie is how horrible the visuals are during the underwater sections. Everything about them is uncomfortable and uneasy on the eyes because of how badly illuminated they are. Half the time they're so dark that you can barely make anything out, and even then the colors are just so boring and uncreative. They don't have any of the variety that was present in the original, which just makes all these scenes unappealing to look at. It does get a little better on the surface world as there's more natural and improved lighting while they're in the sun, but these scenes only take up so much of the story, so most of the movie is just this ugly, shitty blue filter, and that's saying nothing about the horrible CGI on the characters and other background elements. All of them are terribly rendered like a low-budget commercial for some kind of shampoo product, and they don't have any of the white expression that was in the original movie. The hand-drawn style of the original allowed for these different facial expressions and emotions that can't be replicated with CGI, and because of the changes they made to everyone's designs, it makes it more difficult for them to emote. Even the cinematography during these underwater scenes is really bad. It's shot in a way that only deepens the problems with the film's horrible saturation that just makes everything difficult to look at. The overly dark aesthetic of the visuals is so unappealing to engage with. They're clearly trying to make the movie more epic when all it does is make it more difficult to see anything. I still have a headache from all the time I spent squinting to make out anything that was in a shot. It's really that terrible. But hey, bad cinematography, lack of colors, bad saturation, and shitty CGI is what you come to expect from these remakes. It's not really anything new. What about the movie's other elements? Oh, they suck. Like, really badly. The first and most obvious problem being the acting. The cast just acts really wooden with most of the dialogue they deliver, and they don't have the proper range of expression to the point it feels like they have the same stilted face the whole time. I'm sure they're doing their best with the material they're given to work with, but the direction they're given is so bare and pale. The biggest example of this is Halle Bailey as Ariel, who I'm sure a lot of people will have a lot of friendly things to say about me in the comments section for saying anything negative about her performance in this movie. Watching this again, I have to admit she's not too bad. I mean, she's far from the worst actress I've seen in these live-action remakes. But these are the Disney live-action remakes we're talking about, so that's not exactly a difficult bar to jump over. She just looks so disinterested in everything going on. Every facial expression she has is about as bright and expressive as a cardboard box on the side of a dirty street. She puts so little energy into emoting or making the right facial expression that you might as well be watching The Lion King 2019. The overall direction of her acting is stilted and lifeless a lot of the time. And even without that, she's just so boring. She doesn't have any of the same spunk or lively energy as her animated counterpart, nor does her line delivery have any of the same level of charm that Jodie Benson provided. She delivers what is arguably the most sleep-inducing performance on screen. Even during what should be high-stakes intense moments in the story, she has the same bored look on her face, like she's listening to a college professor lecturing her about math. I really don't like sounding mean towards Halle Bailey because she is a talented singer, and I'm sure she's a nice person when she's not being paid to promote shitty movies, but she's just too melancholy and doesn't even come close to recapturing the spirit of the animated version. That version of Ariel was just so much more passionate and lively, curious and enthusiastic about pursuing her interests and being amazed by all the new things she's experiencing while she's a human. Then there's Jonah King as Eric, who yes is indeed handsome, but is still not a good actor. He does emote a bit more than Halle Bailey, but it's still tripe and restricted from emoting the right amount. It's really telling they were trying to expand on his involvement in the story by giving him more presence and adding a new storyline about his relationship with his mom, because they thought he was just a wooden stereotypical love interest in the original. Obviously this is just the filmmakers being stupid. Eric in the original was a really fun character. He was really active and had a very outgoing personality. He was adventurous, he was interested in the legends of merpeople, he wanted to explore the sea, and he was also down to earth in spite of his royalty. He dresses in casual clothes and makes an effort to relate to his subjects. That's why he was so fun-loving and expressive while dancing with the sailors before the big storm. And his romantic chemistry with Ariel made the two of them arguably the best Disney couple at the time. They spend a lot of time together. They have common interests while exploring the town. And in spite of Ariel not having the ability to speak, they did a fantastic job establishing their relationship. The way the two work off each other, with Ariel using body language and expression to communicate and interact with Eric, is really adorable. And it shows how Eric loved her for her fun-loving and outgoing personality instead of just her singing voice. He feels like he's allowed to be himself while he's with her instead of just conforming to the royal attitude others expected from him. He was even willing to give up on his initial dream girl for Ariel because just spending time with her made him happy. But the remake thought this wasn't good enough, so they threw in this stupid nonsense where his backstory is just a gender-swapped version of Ariel's. His mother is overprotective and overbearing and doesn't want him pursuing his interest in exploring another world. Oh gee, does that sound familiar? Making it so that Ariel and Eric are mirrors of each other by being fascinated in each other's worlds takes away the uniqueness their relationship had in the original. The two of them were already a great couple. They didn't need to add this cliche "I'm just like you" plot point on top of that. It just feels like the filmmakers were trying too much with Eric's character. They don't even really do anything to make him more interesting. Even his relationship with his mom is underdeveloped, so it feels like a pointless addition. They sucked all the fun out of his character and made him one-dimensional. And of course, you have Melissa McCarthy as Ursula, and she wishes she could even be a tenth as good as Pat Carroll was. Her version of Ursula was a blast. She was conniving, sultry, sarcastic, smug, and filled with so much toxic drag queen energy. In spite of her slightly small screen time, she leaves an overwhelming impression. She plays off of Ariel's naivety and manipulates her perfectly, and the slimy, malice-filled line deliveries from Carol are so memorable and addicting to listen to. She's just like Scar in that she's such a fun villain to watch. A villain you love to hate because of how delightful their personality is while manipulating the hero. Melissa McCarthy doesn't have any of these things carried over in her performance. Her acting is boring. Her line delivery is boring. Her body language is boring. It's like the filmmakers watched the original Ursula and then told Melissa, yeah, try to be not that. Normally I wouldn't make a big deal out of this, but Ursula was a fantastic top-tier villain, and the remake systematically fails to recapture her essence, hiring a terrible actress who had like one good movie in her catalog. How do you get Ursula this wrong? How do you make Ursula of all villains boring? That should be scientifically impossible, and yet you pulled it off. Every one of the actors just looks unenthusiastic and unengaged with their performances, which results in the characters they're representing being badly translated. And even if you cut out the tone-deaf acting, the character writing is still garbage. For one, they made King Triton less sympathetic and more brutish. In the original, when he destroys Ariel's stuff, he shows remorse for it because he recognizes how he let his anger explode. There was a hint of grief and regret in his actions that helped him feel relatable. In the remake, he just gives Ariel a stern, commanding look and orders her to never leave again. That is downright domestic abuse. Triton was overprotective in the original, but they also took the time to implement human aspects of his character. His character arc is about him learning how even though he had good intentions, he was still being a bad father. He went about looking after Ariel's safety the wrong way due to his prejudice towards humans, and at the end of the film, he learns to let Ariel live her own life. And that scene when he's sitting on the throne thinking about what happened and he says to himself, "What have I done?" That was an amazing bit of character building. He made a mistake and he regrets it a lot. The remake doesn't do anything to include the human aspect Triton had in the original, which makes his turnaround at the end less rewarding. They made him less empathetic and caring while making him more strict and possessive of Ariel. It's just not the same character who properly developed in the original movie. Even when they get to that part where he's sitting on his throne thinking back to what he did and says to himself, "What have I done?" that's supposed to humanize him, and maybe it does, but the line delivery and pacing of the moment are so dour and flat that you don't buy into it. They also badly mishandle Ariel's character by making it so she's never been on the surface before, which completely defeats the plot. If she's never been to the surface, why does she have any fascination for it? And not to mention during Under the Sea, she joins in on the song when she's supposed to feel disconnected from the stuff Sebastian is singing about. They literally made the same mistake as Kingdom Hearts 2. Ariel is not supposed to be singing alongside everyone in Under the Sea because it shows how she's still interested in the human world over life in the sea. Oh, and did I mention they made her a girl boss? Apparently they thought she was just a damsel in distress in the original, so they had to make her more active and heroic in this one. Fact check, you fucking morons. Ariel was never a damsel in distress. She rescues Flounder and Eric multiple times in the story, and she was also really defiant towards her father. And she didn't abandon her family just because she wanted a man. She was always passionate about the surface world, wanting to explore a different culture and being fascinated with it. The reason she ran away was because her father destroyed her stuff. She was never allowed to explore her passion, which made her feel unhappy with her life as a princess. And spending time with Eric made her feel alleviated from that stress. But no, they had to change the climax to not only make it so that she's the one who breaks Ursula's charm to free her voice when in the original it was the combined efforts of all her friends, but also make it so that she kills Ursula to save Eric instead of the other way around. The whole point of the climax was Eric risking his life to save Ariel. This in turn would cause Triton to second guess his belief about humans and allow Ariel to be with him. Now the ending makes no sense because Eric doesn't do anything to prove the good side of humans. It doesn't even make sense for Ursula to focus on Eric because in the remake, Ariel is still the one who causes her to misfire and kill her pets. She's supposed to focus on Ariel as an act of revenge, which gave Eric the opening he needed. It doesn't even make any fucking sense for her to be able to steer that ship into her because she still has her mermaid body. You literally cannot steer a ship like this without legs. It's not physically possible. And to make it even worse, they turned Ariel into a Mary Sue by making it so that she perfectly steers a ship for the first time in her life in the middle of a storm with no difficulty whatsoever. What is this, the rise of Skywalker? Everything about the story is completely ruined by this rewrite of the climax. It makes Eric a damsel in distress. It turns Ariel into another fucking girl boss. It makes Ursula look like an idiot. And it makes Triton's turnaround at the end make no sense. There's so many things wrong with the character writing in this movie, and oh dear God, I haven't even talked about what the fuck they did to Scuttle yet. First of all, shame on you for casting Awkwafina. Did you guys learn nothing from Raya and the Last Dragon? Second, shame on you for turning her character into a cringe-inducing comic relief. Every time she's on screen, it actively makes the movie 5 times worse. She literally sucks the energy out of every single scene she's in and regurgitates it into a pile of slop. The character is already obnoxious, and it's made even worse by how unbearable her line deliveries are. And oh good lord, that fucking Scuttlebutt song. Whoever listened to this shit and allowed it to make it into the film needs to be executed. It is pure torture to the eardrums. The horrific screeching, the awful lyrics, the tone-deaf instrumentals, the childish singing. It is in the top 3 worst songs that Disney has ever made. And speaking of the songs, how about those garbage controversies? The filmmakers changed the lyrics of several songs because they thought they were degrading towards women, even though Ariel is the one trying to get Eric to kiss her, and Ursula is the fucking villain trying to gaslight Ariel. Even then, these renditions of the original songs are awful. The music is stale, the vocal performances are subpar with the exception of Holly, they don't have any of the passion from the original soundtrack, and the cinematography is terrible. The cinematography in the original made the musical numbers fun to listen to and watch at the same time. They took advantage of the underwater setting to provide us with all sorts of angles that capture the scope of the atmosphere. The remake is just generic wide shots that don't properly capture the atmosphere of the songs. You're just watching shitty green screen effects without any of the enticing camera work the original had. And the new plot points they threw in are completely wasted. What was the point of including these new elements if they're never used to expand the story? Ursula and Triton being brother and sister, the hate between humans and merpeople that's never explored then just gets magically resolved at the end, not explaining how Triton's daughters are made up of different ethnicities if they have the same mom? Like seriously, did he adopt them or did he just proudly cheat on his wife multiple times? Like what's going on? And then there's that stupid shit with Ursula making it so Ariel forgets she's supposed to kiss Eric every time they're about to kiss. What was the point of the whole Vanessa thing then? That's a GG move. Game over. You win. Just wait for the 3-day time limit and you're good. God damn, this movie just gets worse and worse the more I think about it. It does absolutely nothing to do justice by the original, taking everything that made it good and desaturating it in favor of this horrible trend of trying to add realism to the animated movies. The lack of expression, wooden acting, terrible character writing, sterilized song numbers, dragged out pacing by throwing in all these shitty subplots, the god-awful climax. It's such a disaster of an adaptation. Like, it doesn't make me feel angry or insulted like several of these other remakes, but it's just so annoying. The draft of the original is there, but it's so lost in translation that it's impossible to enjoy anything that's happening on screen. Just watch videos of Halle Bailey singing on YouTube and never watch this movie. And maybe go out and buy some good seafood. I know I need it after watching this crap.
I'm actually a misguided good guy.
Okay, I believe you.
Well, here we are. The patient zero of Disney trying to add revisionism to their movies in an attempt to humanize the villains. Okay, for what it's worth, I'm not inherently against what-if stories or reimaginings that try to rewrite the villain as an anti-hero or try to make them sympathetic. When they first started doing it, I could understand the appeal. This was admittedly a new and interesting idea that Disney had never done before, allowing us to see classic stories from the perspective of the villain to explain their motivations or make them more relatable. I can see this idea working with Captain Hook or Ursula or Hades or even Scar if done right. However, I can never see this idea being done with Maleficent. When you think of Disney villains, she immediately comes to mind. She's so iconic and such a huge staple in Disney's rogues gallery that it's almost impossible to compete with her. For many fans, she's not just top 5 material, she's top 3 material, and it's really easy to see why. Her role in Sleeping Beauty as evil incarnate is one for the ages. From her chilling voice, to her malevolent line deliveries, to her intimidating use of dark magic, to her unquenchable lust for power, to her unpredictable personality, to her unapologetically evil attitude and how she thrives and how villainous she is, having so much fun with her own twisted nature. Her presence is so commanding that it leaves you on the edge of your seat wondering what she's gonna do next. She truly set the golden standard for Disney villains going forward, and very few have ever topped her in terms of impact and presence in her movie. So trying to rewrite her as an anti-hero or even a good guy is completely backwards, because it would change her character so drastically that she's no longer the Maleficent. She would just be some character who happens to have the same name as her. And unfortunately, this is what this retelling of Sleeping Beauty does. Seriously, it's in her name. Maleficent means being prone to evil, and yet her character in this movie is not that. But maybe I can save that for later and go over the movie's other problems first. For starters, the 3 good fairies are absolutely atrocious. In the original, they were practically the main characters over Philip. The story follows the efforts they made to take care of Aurora and protect her. They had charming, likable personalities and were also competent caretakers who raised Aurora to be a polite young woman. It made sense for the king and queen to entrust her life with them. But in the remake, these 3 are so fucking incompetent and incapable of raising a child that Maleficent ends up raising her for them. There are several instances where Aurora ends up coming close to dying because she wanders off and the 3 good fairies are too caught up in fighting each other and being idiots. Fuck, they literally leave her unattended outside as a newborn infant. I would actually trust the evil sorceress with a child over them, because this is Rugrats levels of the adults not paying proper attention to what the babies are doing. To the point that you wonder how they haven't ended up dead by the end of the series. They never take their sworn duty to protect the king's daughter seriously, and they're characterized as horrible comic relief. It's a complete middle finger to how they were written in the original movie, and a blatant plot contrivance to force in the whole Maleficent ends up developing a relationship with Aurora thing. There's also King Stefan, who is completely butchered, which I don't even know how you accomplish that because he didn't even have that much character in the original. Not only is the actor horrific in his body language and line delivery, but he's constantly speaking in this terrible Scottish accent I cannot stand. He sounds like a scruffy version of Lucky Charms, and I'm supposed to take it seriously as an intimidating villain voice? At least in Up it was clearly being played off as a joke, but in this movie it's completely straightforward with no sarcasm, so it's just annoying to listen to. On top of that, he's characterized as a deranged lunatic with no consistency or clear motivation. Like, the movie opens with him not wanting to hurt Maleficent, then falling in love with her, then trying to keep others off her trail by convincing the king she's dead. Then the next time we see him, he just hates her for some reason. What was the point of establishing a relationship between them or trying to humanize him if they immediately go back on it? It feels like the movie was setting up a scenario where Stefan still feels remorse for betraying Maleficent and they resolve their differences at the end. Or maybe a storyline where people can have good reasons for doing bad things. Because if he didn't come back with her wings, the king would have just sent more soldiers to kill her. But no, they just make him a lunatic who becomes obsessed with Maleficent to the point that he ignores his dying wife while she's on her deathbed. This version of Sleeping Beauty is supposed to have moral ambiguity to it, and they completely ruin it by throwing a villain into it anyway. The love he had for Maleficent wasn't even genuine because of how rushed it was. They never do anything to acknowledge their past relationship or how they used to love each other. They just rush into the final battle. What was the point of the romance between Maleficent and Stefan if it had no practical impact in the narrative? It's never talked about again. There's no confrontation between the king and his wife about their past. Even during the big showdown, there's no sign from either the dialogue or expression that they used to be lovers or even friends. It's a blatant waste of the story they set up in the beginning, making the first 20 minutes of the movie a complete waste of time. Even then, he has no relationship with any of the other characters, so he has no practical impact on the film. In the original, Stefan was a good, kindly king who loved his wife, and he was ecstatic about seeing the return of his daughter, who he was robbed of seeing for many years. But in the remake, he doesn't care about his wife or his daughter, and it's also the other way around. At the end of the movie, no one in the kingdom seems to care that he died. Not the three fairies, not Aurora, not any of his subjects. No one in this movie cared about him, so why should we? He's a waste of a villain and a character who should have just been cut from the story. They also made the movie's visuals really unappealing. Remember that beautiful 2D art style made from the aesthetic of a medieval painting? All those wonderful colors and backgrounds? Let's just replace that with ugly CGI and more desaturated set pieces with horrible lighting. Is this just a thing for Disney? Do they really just get off to removing all the color and making it so you have to squint to make anything out? It's not even a cohesive story. There's so many badly underdeveloped plot points and holes that you can mistake it for a piece of Swiss cheese. They never explain the conflict between the human kingdom and forest creatures. They just throw us into it to create a new conflict since they made Maleficent a good guy. There's no backstory, no explanation for why they're fighting, no motivation for why the humans are invading them. All we know is that they're fighting because the king is a dick. Also, how does Maleficent sleep through her fucking wings being cut off? How do you not react to your limbs being cut off with material that's supposed to burn your skin? And then the wings just fly back to her after they're released from that cage. Now the tension from that moment is gone. The scene where Maleficent was horribly maimed and lost her faith in humanity? Just a minor inconvenience since her wings were easily reattached. Not to mention they give her all these scenes where she demonstrates all the magic powers that she uses to overwhelm her enemies, and then she just never uses them again. Oh no, she's surrounded by the king's knights. It's not like she can just use telekinesis or set stuff on fire to fend them off or something. There's no authentic tension in the final battle because there's so many ways she can use her powers to instantly defeat them, and she never does so because the writers are idiots. She doesn't even turn into a dragon in this one. She just turns her crow companion into one during the battle. Yeah, remember the offensive false advertising this movie gave us? How they made it look like she was gonna do the iconic transformation? Well, too bad, because that was just a stinger they used in the trailer to get people excited. The one scene in the movie that everyone was excited to see, and instead they ended up The Last of Us Part 2ing it. Fuck you. Fuck the both of you. But putting all that aside, how does the movie handle Maleficent herself? Well, not very good. It's pretty easy to tell they were going the Wicked route in retelling a classic story from the perspective of the villain, but the problem is that they don't understand what made Wicked work. It doesn't drastically change the core of the characters while providing a wider context for Elphaba's backstory. You can't do that with Maleficent because there was no deeper complex motivation behind her actions. She wanted to kill a baby and emotionally torture her parents just because it made her laugh. She was too madly evil for this to work. But even putting that aside, the chemistry between her and Aurora is just not compelling. The extent of their relationship is just, Aurora is fascinated by magic stuff. Maleficent watches her being fascinated by magic stuff. Maleficent has a basic talk with Aurora about right and wrong. Aurora finds out Maleficent cursed her and feels betrayed. She kisses her to break the spell and they make up. It's just so underdeveloped and we don't learn anything new about these characters while they interact with each other. Aurora herself is boring and gets no real development. And I get this is a problem people had with the original movie as she barely had any character. But in the original Sleeping Beauty, Aurora wasn't the focus of the story. The conflicts surrounding her are. She wasn't the character that you were really meant to connect with. It was the three good fairies and Maleficent. But in this movie, Aurora's clearly meant to have more presence in the story as Maleficent's illegitimate daughter. You would expect her character to be more fleshed out and have a personality. But she just doesn't. She just acts bubbly and quirky. And Maleficent suffers from the same issue. Her character amounts to tough-acting adult who develops a bond with a kid and ends up feeling like a parent to them. There's really nothing else to it. They don't give her a dark side which would be in tune with her original character, something that would add complexity and tension to the situation. There's no reason to get invested in what's going to happen between her and Aurora because there's nothing threatening the bond they have. It would have been more interesting to make this story more of a tragedy, how the two develop a genuine friendship but it ends up falling apart due to their circumstances. Something that leads to a climax similar to the original but Aurora plays a role in it. Maybe she calls Maleficent into giving up on her revenge and the two resolve their differences. But Maleficent understands that it's too dangerous for them to be together. They could have an emotional goodbye where they go their separate ways and try to start a new life for themselves. And as Aurora gets older and rules over the kingdom, Maleficent could watch over her in secret. That would be a story that makes Maleficent more relatable while staying in tune with her villainous side. But nope, they just make it a bland adopted parent and child story. It doesn't go any deeper than that. They couldn't even go all the way with it because they made it so Maleficent sets the conditions for the curse to be broken instead of the fairies. So any hint of villainy Maleficent could have had is absolutely non-existent in this movie. This movie is just not good at all. It completely axe murders everything about the original story to reboot it into this lame make the good guys bad guys and bad guys good guys idea. It clearly wants to be a darker and more mature version of Sleeping Beauty, but it never commits to that. They just play it safe while making Maleficent a good guy. They don't utilize anything that made her an iconic character and they don't expand on the elements of Sleeping Beauty. It's so boring and uninspired. I suppose this movie maybe did some things right to make it into the top 10, or at least avoided doing things to make it as offensive as the other remakes ranked below it, but it's really not anything special. It's just another boring adaptation of a movie that was already perfectly fine that due to its success at the box office, would set another bullshit trend for Disney to capitalize on. I eagerly await the day when Disney does a remake where Frollo is portrayed as a misunderstood and tragic figure. I'm sure that'll go swimmingly.
Hast thou forgotten of the prophecy?
What prophecy?
I don't care if he helped shape someone's childhood. Tim Burton can get fucked for the rest of his career for leading the way for Disney to keep shitting out these garbage remakes with the success of Alice in Wonderland 2010. A remake so not like the original it's based on that I don't know if it even counts for the metrics of this list. It is absolutely nothing like the animated movie or even the original book. If you want to tell a different story, then tell a different story. Don't use an iconic IP to trick people into watching your garbage product. Honestly, this movie should have been called Alice Returns to Wonderland because that's what it's actually about. And it just makes the movie more of a member-berry jerkfest with Tim Burton constantly going, "Hey, remember this from the original? Do you like how I updated it?" Well, Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland updates nothing. It's a terrible downgrade in every single way you can imagine. And the first and most obvious evidence of this is the CGI. And look, I know a lot of people really like Tim's visual direction and it's always going to be the best part of his movies. And I know when this movie first came out a lot of people liked the special effects. I'll admit even I thought it was cool when it first came out. But good God, nowadays it just looks so horrible. The CGI in this movie aged so badly. A lot of it looks like badly rendered extras from Mars Needs Moms. The characters are glossy and weightless, making it feel like none of their actions have any impact. And the backgrounds are so devoid of any sense of joy and style. The overuse of these computer effects completely ruins the creativity that was built into the original story. And it's also desaturated and flat with a distracting absence of color, which I'm sure Tim tried to rationalize by saying his adaptation was meant to be a darker and more mature take on the source material, which apparently he hated. Okay, rule number 1 in remaking a beloved animated classic. If you don't like the animated classic, then don't remake the animated classic, because you're just showing in great detail that you have no respect for the original property and just want to cash in on its popularity. Seriously, why would you remake something you have no emotional connection to? A remake like that is doomed from the start because you have no understanding of the source material and there's no faithfulness to the original that you're intent on updating. The biggest example of this is how Tim took this story that's supposed to be an exploration of nonsensical nihilism and turned it into a stupid prophecy chosen one storyline. Okay, rule number 2 when remaking a beloved animated classic. Don't change the story into a stupid prophecy chosen one plot. Seriously, how did this fucking tool look at Alice in Wonderland and think to himself, "Oh yeah, this needs a chosen one storyline"? It completely contradicts the message they're going for about embracing our individuality when Alice spends the entire movie doing all the things the prophecy predetermined for her. Tim takes a wild and chaotic story about a girl exploring wacky land and turns it into a generic run-of-the-mill fantasy epic. Alice in Wonderland wasn't supposed to be an epic battle for a kingdom. It was a simple, down-to-earth story about a girl trying to make sense out of a silly, nonsensical place created from her imagination. But thanks to Tim Burton, now it's all prophecy this and prophecy that. They even go so far as to completely give away the ending by saying straight up that Alice will succeed in slaying the dragon. Now there's no stakes in tension anymore because we know she's gonna win. Why should we care about any of this? Even if they didn't give away the ending, it still ruins the movie by turning every character into a tool. There's no natural choices made by any of the characters because the events of the plot are completely dictated by this stupid piece of paper. It's the same thing that happened to Naruto and Harry Potter, but the worst thing about this stupid Chosen One nonsense is how it goes against the message of Alice in Wonderland. Wonderland is supposed to represent how Alice is going to experience new things as she gets older. It was like Peter Pan in that the story was about a child going through the ups and downs of leaving their childhood behind while entering adulthood. But here, Alice is already an adult, so the movie completely misunderstands the message of the original story. They retcon her character to make it how she's expected to conform to societal norms when she just wants to be herself, but she spends the entire movie conforming to what society expects her to do because of that stupid prophecy. On top of that, the movie never explores her own desires or what she wants in life, so her character has no motivation. All we ever know about her is that she doesn't want to be like other girls. She wants to defy societal norms and be her own girl. Oh, how riveting. Another stupid girl boss caricature. And maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if they took the time to give her an actual personality, but they couldn't even be bothered to do that. Her acting is so horrible and disinterested, I keep thinking the real actress was kidnapped and replaced with a robot. She's a flat plank who never expresses any sort of emotion. All of her line deliveries are completely dour and pale with no variety to her fluctuation. Even the big off with your head line when she slays the dragon, which you'd think would have a raw sense of anger behind it, is horribly delivered. I don't know if she was miscasted or if she was directed to be like this, but it makes her character so terrible. Alice in the original was a more interesting character because she was a logical person contrasting a non-logical place. The original was an anthology about her trying to make sense of this world. Its entertainment value came from how she interacted with all the oddities she came across. The movie was made that way because Alice in Wonderland at its core was about nonsensical nihilism. How the real world can be just as random as the fantasies we make up in our heads. It benefited her character arc about being ready for the real world when she gets older, and the movie shows this by how she confronts the obstacles she faces. She didn't use brute force while swinging a sword to overcome her challenges. She used her wit and reason. The original Alice was a bright character filled with personality. Remake Alice is stilted and dull. Like it's not even a contest which version of the character is better. Well, what about the other characters, you might ask? Well, they're pretty bad too. All the citizens of Wonderland are deprived of their madness and over-the-top personalities from the original. They behave more like party members you team up with in an RPG. The worst example of this is Johnny Depp as the Mad Hatter. Firstly, the character is written to be this traumatized war refugee trying to recover from the loss of his friends and home. I'm pretty sure the original Mad Hatter wouldn't care about something like that. It's a common problem with the characters in this movie. The remake tries to make them more logical when they're not supposed to be. It defeats the purpose of Wonderland being a backwards place. Depp's version of the character isn't mad, he's just a little weird. He also speaks in like 4 different accents, which is really grating to put up with. It just comes across as really bad impressions of his previous roles like Jack Sparrow. And the big scary dragon we're supposed to be intimidated by isn't even scary because he's not a character. He's just a tool that's used as a plot device. He has a total of 2 lines of dialogue and he only appears during the last 15 minutes of the movie. What was the point of getting Christopher Lee to voice this guy if you're not gonna utilize him? It's a completely disrespectful waste of his talent. And while I've already criticized the CGI, I've yet to criticize the actual design of Wonderland. Everything about it is completely disenchanted and dull compared to pretty much any other adaptation of the movie, or even the original book. Even the video games were more creative because Wonderland represented Alice's trauma and deteriorating mental health. The remake just makes it look bland and gloomy for the sake of being edgy. And then for some stupid reason, they retcon Wonderland by throwing in a pointless twist that Alice just remembered the name wrong. Because you see, it's not called Wonderland, it's actually called Underland. What? But why? Why is it called Underland? Because it takes place underground? You seriously had to take Wonderland's identity away just for a pointless change like that? Seriously, Tim? Fuck you. The only thing about this movie that's kind of entertaining is Helena Carter as the Queen of Hearts. She's actually pretty in tune with how the character is supposed to be. Her acting is good and she gets her over-the-top anger and mannerisms down faithfully. She's fairly commanding in her line deliveries and how she interacts with the other characters, making her a believable threat and a reasonably well-scripted villain. She is fun to watch, but it's just not enough to save the movie. But above everything else, what makes this movie so terrible is how Tim deliberately ignores all the creative elements of the original novel. Alice in Wonderland was never a story that was appropriate for his style of filmmaking. It was a surreal experience completely devoid of logic. It was a world that operated from the view of a child and its main character was having a coming-of-age experience with it. That's what made it so imaginative. It was a childlike fantasy experience that gravitated towards kids. Tim takes all the whimsy and imagination away from the original and makes it not that. It's not even original in terms of being a Tim Burton movie. It's just a shitty copy of his previous works. Even if this was just its own thing and not an adaptation of a beloved classic, it's still a boring by-the-numbers hero's journey that's been done better in hundreds of other movies. It's a style over substance movie through and through. Wonderland was supposed to be a world without any clear order or direction to it, and trying to inject those things into Alice in Wonderland makes it not Alice in Wonderland anymore. It might as well just be a different property entirely. I guess if there's something nice I can say about this movie, it's that it could have been a lot worse. It's still terrible, but not to the point of being extremely offensive like the other movies ranked below it on this list. It was definitely not a good start for this trend that Disney would pursue in light of its box office success, but it's like I said, it certainly could have been a lot worse. Oh, how far we have fallen.
You're gay! He's gay!
Okay, I'll admit it. Out of all these live-action remakes, Beauty and the Beast 2017 is the one that I feel the most sorry for. Like, with the right tweaks, it could have been good. Unlike so many of these other remakes, this one had huge potential. The trailers actually made me interested in how they were gonna tackle this one. There was a strong feeling of familiarity to it, and it seemed like they were putting a genuine effort in recreating the charm of the original. The set pieces alone are fantastic. This is how I'd imagine these places would look if they were done in live action. And unlike so many of these horrible remakes, the lighting and saturation are actually good. The colors and the lighting allow you to appreciate the full scope of everything that went into recreating these settings, and the cinematography is surprisingly captivating. All of these shots that capture the scope of every location that really make you feel like you've been sucked into the world of the film. The town, the castle, the tavern where they sing Gaston, the sunny hillside where Belle sings about seeking adventure, it all looks so fantastic. But then I remembered these things don't matter if the story and characters are bad, and sadly that's what we ended up getting. Alright, to its credit, there are things this remake does that are interesting changes. It adds a new effect to the spell in which the castle servants become more and more like the inanimate objects they were turned into, and when the spell's timer runs out, they actually die. They completely transform into the castle's furniture and lose their sentience. It adds more stakes and tension to the story rather than just having them remain talking furniture. And even though I am gonna complain about him later for obvious reasons, I really like what they did with LeFou here. They made him into an actual character in the narrative instead of just a bumbling sidekick for Gaston. He has a fun personality. He's really outgoing and active. He has moments of doubt in his judge of character when he sees how Gaston is turning into a psychopath. And he even redeems himself at the end when he helps the castle servants fight the angry mob. He serves a practical purpose in the story instead of just being comic relief. And they still retain his comedic side by giving him some humorous chemistry with the other characters. Even the Beast has a new backstory that takes some inspiration from the Broadway musical. They delve into how the death of his mother at such a young age and the neglect he received from his father affected his social skills and mannerisms. It gives more of an actual reason for why he behaves badly instead of the stereotypical, oh, he was just spoiled by his pampered lifestyle. And sadly, that's where my praises of this movie end. The biggest glaring issue is the terrible acting from Emma Watson. I mean, the rest of the actors are okay for what they're given to work with, but oh my god, Watson is just awful. Like, now that Harry Potter is past the prime of its popularity, can we all just collectively agree that she's not a good actor?
Blasphemy!
The way she works off the other characters is so undercooked and flat. Her facial expressions are stilted and her line deliveries are so stagnant and unengaged with her situation. Every second she's on screen, she does not look like she's committing herself to this role. Belle is one of Disney's most universally beloved female leads, and Emma just made her so boring. Oh, and did I mention she can't sing either? I guess Watson decided the original wasn't feminist enough, so she had to update the character in her own image, which just ends up making her look like, another girl boss. Good job, idiot. You turned Belle from Beauty and the Beast into a girl boss. But with that put to the side, how does the movie adapt the characters and plot? Well, unfortunately, it's very underwhelming. The first major downgrade is how the remake has a less interesting framework for its prologue. The original opened with stained glass windows to illustrate the events that set the groundwork for the rest of the story. It was a literal window into the prince's selfish behavior and how he was cursed with a form that mirrored his brash personality. And it made sense for there to be a narration because the glass windows didn't convey enough movement to establish what was happening. But the remake replaces the stained glass windows with showing us what happens. There's no reason for the narration because we can clearly see what's happening. It strongly enters tell don't show territory when they could have just shown how the prince was punished for his bad behavior. That would have been an interesting and unique difference from the original. An opening that shows us what happened. Even if you prefer the stained glass windows, it still would have been its own thing separate from the original. But no, they had to throw in the stupid narration over it because they have no confidence in your attention span. It's storytelling 101 and you blew it in the first 3 minutes of the movie. And if that wasn't bad enough, they also had to ruin the pacing by making it atrociously fast. You'd think that would be an impossibility due to its longer runtime, but they somehow made the movie too long while also making it go by too quickly. There's so many scenes from the original that had a slow, methodical movement to them. It added to the build-up and suspense to help create tension, but the remake just fast-forwards through so many of these scenes to the point that you could quickly respond to a text message and you would miss them. Belle meeting Beast for the first time, they rush through it with no proper build-up. Beast's outburst when Belle threatens the safety of the Rose, it's a 7-second outburst. The suspense of Belle being brought to her room as she absorbs the danger of being a prisoner in the castle, they just casually walk to her room with no emotional weight behind her situation. And these are just the worst examples. There's way more scenes like this. Because of all the filler and new subplots they added, they end up rushing through elements of the original and make them less meaningful. These new subplots don't even do anything to expand the story, so there's no reason for them to be here. Like when they talk about how Belle's mom died. It made sense to do this for the Beast because it gave us a reason for why he grew up to be spoiled and mean. But here we learn nothing about Belle that we didn't already know. It adds nothing to her character, so it's a completely pointless subplot. They also had to make it so that Belle is an inventor now. Yeah, it's her doing the inventing and not Maurice, even though it ends up being a completely meaningless addition. There's like one scene where she utilizes a horse and a barrel to invent a washing machine, and then her being an inventor is never mentioned again in the entire movie. She never utilizes her smarts or her inventive nature after this, so it's a bullshit addition to make her more feminist. And not to mention, they muddied the romantic chemistry between Belle and the Beast very badly. Remember how I said the original had a slow pace to it? It allowed the connection between the two to build up. You can see how they feel and what they were going through by just the expressions and body language. These scenes helped make the Beast feel more human in spite of his quick temper and spoiled attitude. Scenes like him rubbing his back while glancing around because he feels bad about Belle feeling like a trapped prisoner, or Beast slowly calming down after an angry outburst before realizing the weight of what he did and face-palming in shame. Or him feeling doubt that Belle will ever see him as anything but a monster, causing him to feel shame in himself. Or how about that scene where he makes the ultimate sacrifice so Belle can rescue her father? This is his only chance to break the spell and regain his humanity. You can see it in his eyes and the way he moves his hand. But then he turns away from the Rose while releasing Belle, symbolizing his decision to give up being human for her happiness. The remake doesn't include any of these things. Their interactions are so stagnant and casual that you never feel a connection between them. In the original, when Beast offers her the library, he does it as a gift. It's a token of gratitude to show her she's appreciated and that he really understands her. In the remake, he gives her the library as part of a boring story about reading. There's no enthusiasm in his voice when he shows it to her. He sounds completely bored. The body language and expressions were a deeply important element of the romance in the original, and the remake makes it dull by removing them. This was the kind of thing you can't replicate in live action. All the smooth gestures and wide expressions that made the romance more palatable. Now it's just two actors imitating what happened in the original but with less expression. And it's so boring. And it's made even worse by the introduction of this plot hole of a magic book that can literally take them anywhere. Yeah, a magic device Belle can use to escape the castle at any moment? Let's just casually show it to her. Why is there a magic book that can teleport them anywhere? And for that matter, why don't they use it? Isn't there a scene later in the story where Belle has to rush to her father's rescue? So use the fucking book! Why are you riding back to the town on horseback? They also made the townspeople needlessly cruel towards Belle. In the original, they thought she was interesting. They were weirded out by how different she was, but they were also curious about her. They literally call her strange but special in the opening song. They just saw it as harmless daydreaming about wanting more out of life than a simple suburban lifestyle they were used to. But in the remake, they persecute her and act like they're gonna burn her at the stake. It's like they think a woman reading is a sign of witchcraft. Where did this animosity come from? So black people are treated with the same human decency as white people in a movie set in 18th century France, but a girl isn't allowed to read? What kind of bullshit hypocritical diversity is that? And while Luke Evans is a really good actor, he just doesn't give us a good version of Gaston. Maybe it was the direction or the writing, but the character is really off. In the original, Gaston was a fun anti-hero turned villain. He starts off as the town hero who's celebrated and beloved by everyone except the girl he wants to get with. He had a bombastic cartoony ego that was fun to watch. He was arrogant but also comical and jovial, and his attitude was relatively harmless at first. His villainy was brought upon by his desperation to be with Belle, and his descent into insanity was pretty entertaining. He was larger than life but also pretty scary when you think about how messed up and sexist he is in his pursuit of getting Belle. And the thing that made him interesting as a villain was that his transformation was quiet and subtle. When you're watching this the first time, you don't see him as a villain, just a self-absorbed guy caught up in his charisma. But as the movie progresses, he becomes more sinister and menacing under your nose. When he does turn out to be a menacing villain, it feels more shocking, because he manages to manipulate both the townspeople and you into thinking he's a good guy. And when the ruse is lifted up and he tries to have Maurice locked up as blackmail to get Belle to be with him, it's really diabolical. The remake skips over all that intrigue and just makes him a diabolical villain way too early. There's no build-up to his more sinister personality, he just randomly decides to leave Maurice to die in the woods. It takes away from the charisma he's supposed to have, making his personality more restrained and one-dimensional. The Enchantress is also made into a really sadistic person, almost to the point that she could be the villain. Okay, so she punishes the prince by turning him into a beast for his bad behavior. That's understandable, but she takes it way beyond that. Remember earlier how I said the people in the castle will die by transforming into inanimate objects? She did that. She made the spell extra scary. That is a really horrifying thing to do. And it's also heavily implied that she erased people's memories and kept families apart. Why would she do that? Those people had nothing to do with the prince's cruelty. And on top of that, she literally watches Gaston try to have Maurice killed and locked up, and she does nothing. Why aren't you transforming him into a beast? He's way worse than how the prince was behaving. They were clearly trying to increase her presence in the story by making her this unsuspecting sorceress overlooking everything, but the implications of her actions throughout the movie are extremely alarming. Instead of simply teaching the prince a lesson in humility, she dooms an entire castle to death and allows Gaston to harass people. And we're supposed to see her as a good guy? That is really fucked up. The musical numbers are also less engaging, mostly because they're not fun to watch. Like, they have good vocals if you mute the TV whenever Emma Watson opens her mouth, and they have a good orchestra for the background music, but the original made the songs fun to listen to and fun to watch. They had really striking visuals and a blend of different colors while having all sorts of dancing and energetic movement from the characters. It really felt like an animated Broadway musical. There was so much energy to everything happening on screen. But the remake replaces all the outstanding and bombastic visuals with lazy choreography, unorganized camera angles, and awkward facial expressions in between the singing. Half the time there's no energy to it. They're just standing like statues while singing with bored facial expressions. And the new songs they added are horrible. They have horrible lyrics, tone-deaf instrumentals, and even the vocal performances are unenthusiastic. The worst of them is definitely Forevermore. Not just because of the horrible vocals, but because it makes no sense. Beast just released Belle from the castle, sacrificing his humanity so she can rescue her father. This is supposed to be the point of the story where he loses all hope. So why is he singing a song about being hopeful? That's like singing a song about how you're gonna go on wild adventures and explore the world after just finding out you have stage 4 cancer. And this of course leads me into the elephant in the room. You remember how I talked about LeFou being a fun character in spite of a huge glaring issue I was gonna go into later? Well, that's because Disney really wants you to know that this version of LeFou is gay.
He's gay!
Okay, look. If one of the characters is homosexual, that's not a problem. Like, if LeFou was always meant to be homosexual even as far back as the original, I wouldn't care. Homosexual representation in a movie is not inherently bad. What is inherently bad is how offensively Disney used this element of the movie as a means to manipulate people into buying tickets. Disney was not subtle about this. Like, at all. You couldn't go 10 minutes without some sort of headline about how LeFou in Beauty and the Beast 2017 was Disney's first openly gay character. Which is a bold-faced lie because I watched House of Mouse growing up. Disney really wanted to hammer in how inclusive and accepting they are of LGBT people when this is the same company that cuts LGBT content from their products on a regular basis. And you'd think the marketing would be bad enough, but the movie itself is just as bad. The problem isn't that LeFou is homosexual, the problem is that the movie never shuts the fuck up about how LeFou is homosexual. They are constantly shoveling it down your throat with every single appearance he makes, as if being gay is his only personality trait. They treat LeFou like a token character with his gayness, and it's so painfully obvious why they did this. It's a bullshit publicity stunt that Disney pulled to attract the approval of left-leaning groups of people. Every single nod to his homosexuality is just there to show you that they have it. There's no practical purpose to it. It's just there because Disney wants you to think they're an inclusive company that truly cares about diversity and representation. Yeah, still waiting on an explanation for not casting dwarves in the Snow White remake. Ultimately, this remake is not good. Like, at all. There are parts of it that are good, which is more than I can say for most of these other remakes, but it's still a terrible movie. Like I said before, I really do feel bad for this one because it does seem like it's at least trying to be something of quality, and not just a nostalgic cash grab. The set pieces are amazing, the music is pretty good, the singing is good, for the most part, and LeFou, when you forget how he's being used as a token for Disney's scumbag business practices, is a fun character. But everything else in the movie just falls flat on its face. The romance is sterilized, the characters are less fleshed out, the new subplots add nothing, the Enchantress is turned into a deranged psychopath, and the framing of the story is less interesting. Maybe if this was given a better director and they casted someone more qualified to play Belle, it could have been interesting. But alas, Beauty and the Beast 2017 is just another shitty live-action remake. Its visuals and music might be inviting, but with the movie lacking in every other department, I must politely decline. But hey, that's what you get for hiring the director of the Twilight movies, I guess.
Dragon, not lizard. I don't do that tongue thing.
Okay, let's see what we have next. Wait, Pete's Dragon? What the heck is Pete's Dragon? Wait, that movie from 1977 that no one talks about? That movie got a remake? Well, who knows? Maybe this could be one of the few remakes that ends up being good, right? I mean, even if the original wasn't that good, surely this will be the one that breaks the curse, right? Well, big shock, it's not good either. This is honestly the most bizarre and off-the-wall of these remakes I can think of, because at least the other remakes were based on something that left an impact on people. Pete's Dragon wasn't even well received when it came out, and I can't think of anyone who thinks of it lightly today. The musical numbers were bland, the characters were forgettable, the villains were lame, and the relationship between Pete and Elliot was heavily underutilized. So you'd think this would finally be the one, right? The Disney live-action remake that manages to be a good movie or even better than the original. Well, it is more serviceable than the original, but I don't know if that makes it a good movie. I mean, considering how bland and boring the original was, it shouldn't be hard. Obviously, the effects are better this time around. Elliot feels more organic and detailed, and the way he interacts with Pete is more believable. Actually, I'm kind of impressed by how this is one of the better uses of CGI in these remakes, where the character is actually rendered pretty well and doesn't look like a reject from the Star Wars prequels. It's also admittedly interesting to see the changes they made to Pete's character. In the original, he was sold into labor. In the remake, he was raised in the wild. Seeing him having a difficult time adjusting to human civilization after all the time he spent separated from it is pretty unique and interesting. It feels like how a wild child would actually behave in this situation, and the kid does a surprisingly good job acting the character out. There's a lot of scenes where he doesn't talk and just uses body language and facial expressions to get his emotions across, and it's actually pretty effective. Unfortunately, it only does so much. The movie is still really lackluster. Several problems from the original are carried over here, like how the relationship between Pete and Elliot is still very badly underutilized. It's called Pete's Dragon. You'd think the movie would be about Pete spending time with the dragon, but they spend so much time apart from each other and they barely interact that you never feel a strong connection between them. They have no connection outside of Elliot just flying around with Pete on his back and Pete being excited about flying. Even during the climax when the stakes are dialed up, you'd think there would be a deeper connection, and they still don't do anything with their relationship. Even the way their relationship starts feels weak. Pete ends up orphaned and alone without his parents because of a stupid over-the-top car crash. Like a deer jumps out of nowhere and the dad does a stupid needless hard turn to the right when he could have just slammed on the brakes. And that somehow causes the car to do this wicked flip in the air while falling on the side of the road. And it's all done to extremely unfitting music. Like a horrible car crash killing a kid's parents is ensuing and they're playing this gentle, warm lullaby music over it. You'd think this would call for a moment of silence from the soundtrack or maybe something more melancholy and sad. The cinematography is also really boring and unengaging during more active sequences. It's more enjoyable during these more relaxed scenes where the characters are just connecting, but the scenes with more action to them are not good. The editing is choppy and there's no interesting or engaging perspectives to how we see this stuff going on. They're just really bland and unsatisfying camera shots that take away from the tension. And there's also a lot of horrible dialogue where they try way too hard to be enchanted or whimsical, instead of just, you know, letting the characters talk normally, which would allow them to develop their relationships better. Maybe it would make more sense for this dialogue if this was a fantasy adventure, but aside from a giant dragon we hardly see anyway, there's no fantasy or adventure in this movie. Pete and Elliot hardly interact with each other and Elliot doesn't even talk. Most of the movie takes place in a suburban setting where everyone is living normal lives. So just have the characters talk normally. You don't have to try so hard to be all mystical and enchanting. The other characters are also really bland and forgettable. They're not offensively bad or annoying, they're just sort of there. None of them have interesting personalities or do anything to leave an impression. They just sort of connect with Pete over the course of the movie. There's also a really stupid third act where they introduce a new plot about a group of hunters led by one of the main character's brothers wanting to capture Elliot for reasons. Okay, aside from the fact this story absolutely did not need a villain, it feels like the movie suddenly becomes a completely different story which throws the pacing off. It turns into a dollar store version of E.T. where the kid has to rescue his supernatural friend without any of the stuff that made E.T. exciting and made you connect with it. And they never give a clear motivation for why the villains want to capture Elliot. Is it for money? For media attention? Do they perceive him as a threat? It's never explained. So many elements of the movie are badly underdeveloped and it doesn't do anything unique to stand out from its peers. It's a bland, by-the-number and predictable family film that never takes an interesting turn. The new origins and personalities they give Pete and Elliot have good potential behind them, but they're never expanded on or properly utilized. It's not offensively bad or horrible, it's just very forgettable, which honestly is a breath of fresh air compared to many of the remakes I talked about up to this point. I think this is the point where the Disney live-action remakes finally start to become more tolerable. Perhaps not good movies, but nothing that's a giant middle finger to the originals. And if that's the case, it makes me feel more optimistic about going through what's left on this list. Maybe we'll finally find that one good one as we make it towards the end. I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
You've been a house dog all your life. How would you know?
I know I'm a bit late into the game to ask this question, but why? Just fucking why? Why do these remakes have to have a drastically longer runtime compared to the originals? How do you make them longer when you're still mostly doing the same thing? Why did Lady and the Tramp 2019 need to be an hour and 40 minutes long? It makes the pacing of everything worse. The pacing of the original was perfect. It understood how to keep a slow movement while keeping everything interesting and relatable. It allowed for a greater focus on character moments while developing Lady Tramp and the other dogs. And because it was a love story, it also helped in making Lady and Tramp's relationship more believable. The slow pace allowed the movie to show you how they started bonding and fell in love. It was appropriate for the objective of getting them together as a couple. But thanks to the remake having a longer runtime, all that intrigue is thrown out the window. You remember when I talked about Sonic X's adaptation of Adventure 2 and how one of the reasons it was so horrible was because of the atrocious pacing? How events from the original game ended up being rushed because the anime spent so much time digging around with the human characters? They ended up doing the exact same thing here. Elements from the original which were integral to developing Lady and Tramp's romance are rushed and made less impactful because they had to throw in a bunch of stupid filler focusing on the human characters. Lady and Tramp exploring the zoo to help with her muzzle is replaced with a 20-second bit of them using a statue. The spaghetti scene is made awkward because they had to throw in humans reacting awkwardly to Lady and Tramp eating spaghetti because tee-hee, look at the humans acting all confused. Dogs aren't supposed to eat like that. Isn't that so silly? Tramp saving Lady from wild feral dogs is replaced with this stupid attempt at comedy where Lady pretends to have rabies. Even the new scenes they put in don't do anything to strengthen their relationship and they don't make any sense. Like the first time they meet, Lady is talking to Tramp but mistakes him for Trusty because they're separated by a fence. You've been living next to this guy your whole life and you couldn't recognize his voice? And then he starts acting smug about relating information on the baby by saying, "Oh, now you want my help?" Last I checked, she helped you hide from the dog catcher in exchange for the information. They even had to throw in this cringe dialogue about Tramp condescending Lady's privileged lifestyle by commenting on her 40x40 bathroom, and her response is, "I have walks for that." Oh, what riveting romantic dialogue. I get they were trying to add tension between the two to explore their independence before setting the ground for their romance, but it just needlessly drags out the pacing. In the original, the two simply hit it off and they do pretty well. They had common interests and things they could relate to each other over, so their love was more grounded and properly established rather than sudden like other Disney couples at the time. The remake feels the need to drag it around with all these scenes of playful sarcasm that don't do anything to make the relationship romantic. They feel more like bickering rivals than a couple forming a romance, and they hop from bickering to liking each other so quickly that their romance feels rushed. But maybe I'm getting a bit sidetracked. I was supposed to start with the horrible human filler. The human characters make up the worst parts of the movie by far. Their dialogue and acting is so terrible and forced, and none of it does anything to contribute to the story. There's so many scenes where we just watch them doing nothing, or distracting from the main plot with terrible excuses for comedy. Even Tony and Joe, the guys at the restaurant who sing Bella Notte, are given more screen time than they should. It just distracts from the love story we're supposed to be watching. The worst one is definitely the dog catcher who's practically turned into a main character. Yeah, you know that guy you barely saw in the original? He's a main character now. Every time he shows up, it brings everything to a screeching halt so we can talk about his obsession with capturing Tramp. I get that it's his job to round up wild animals to keep them from causing mayhem, but this guy takes it to such an over-the-top level. He talks about this dog like he's a menace to society and how he must be stopped at all costs, and dude, the worst thing he did was inconvenience some people and steal some food. I'm pretty sure there's more concerning issues in your community. He talks about this dog like he's hunting a feral beast or Moby Dick, it's so ridiculous. He honestly reminds me of the harassers in my Hate'em with all the time he talks about this dog being a menace to society. Actually, that's not a fair comparison. The people harassing me are way more unhinged than this. Another problem with the overfocus on humans is how they pretty much made ladies' owners neglectful and dismissive. In the original, Tramp made it sound like a baby in the house was gonna be a bad thing. And there was reason for concern because of how differently Jim, Deer, and Darling were behaving towards Lady. But when the baby arrives, it ends up being a good thing. They still give attention and love to Lady while letting her interact with the baby. They bring her up to the baby's crib while Darling sings a lullaby to him. It showed that in spite the changes to the household, they were still gonna be a family and not treat Lady less. It was a really sweet scene that showed how Tramp was wrong about his prejudice towards humans, which made him being accepted as part of the family at the end more rewarding. In the remake, the owners actively give less attention to Lady and neglect her. It actually gets so bad that during their first date, Lady tells Tramp that he was right all along. Humans are unloyal and completely forget about you as soon as a baby gets involved. That is such a terrible rewrite of events from the original movie in an attempt to develop their romance. And it also makes Lady out to be more self-centered and quick to abandon the people who raised her. In the original, she tells Tramp she can't just live the life of a wild dog because it meant leaving her family behind. She knew she had to go back to help them watch over the baby. It showed how loyal she was and how much she cared about her family. Here, she doesn't even think about all the care and nurturing they provided for her over the years. They even have to do this stupid back and forth where she can't make up her mind on how she feels. Like, did they abandon you or did they not? It was a really good character moment in the original, and the remake just takes it away. It makes the story weaker because Lady is given no real catalyst to return home. But there's also a much bigger problem with this remake, one that's not immediately apparent until you really start to notice it. One of the most unique things about Lady and the Tramp was how it was entirely done from the perspective of the dogs. The point of view of the canine characters was rarely, if ever, broken because the movie knew that's what made people gravitate towards the story. 90% of the time you don't even see the faces of the humans, and even when you do, it's meant to convey how the dogs react to all these situations. The low vintage camera angles where they only show the legs and feet of the humans help to establish how this is Lady's world, and this is how she perceives many of the things that happen to her. This style of storytelling allowed them to focus on how human the animal characters can get, and the low view of everything made it feel more like a dog's life. But the remake removes that aspect of the story because of the oversaturation of the humans. There's even scenes in the movie that don't include the dogs at all. Lady and the Tramp was interesting because it always kept us in the dog's world. They were the primary element of everything that was happening. The remake frequently leaves the dog's world to focus on the humans, which doesn't even affect the story because they never developed them. Now the movie as a whole has more stagnant and less dynamic cinematography. Even the movie's color palette just feels dull. Like, it does have more color than Peter Pan or The Little Mermaid or Wonderland, but the visual aesthetic just feels underwhelming. The original was made up of beautiful lush paintings that allowed for so much expression while making the world feel tangible. Everything was so soft and smooth and relaxing to look at. It felt remarkable and unique seeing all these things with the imaginative mix of color and design. But the remake's aesthetic just feels boring. Not that it's difficult to see anything, but they don't do anything creative with any of these set pieces. Everything just looks average now. Average street, average neighborhood, average back alley for the restaurant, and the bland cinematography just makes it even more boring. There's also the really choppy way in which the dogs talk. There's definitely more expression and the animals actually emote, unlike The Lion King 2019. But the way their lips move around just looks really off-putting. Because of how realistic they tried to make the animals look while still making them animated, it makes the facial expressions more cartoony. The original's 2D artwork allowed for grounded expressions with no offset because of how everything was animated. Here they try to combine live action with animation, and the CGI just sticks out like a sore thumb. But hey, as long as they stay true to the romance aspect of the movie, it should be good, right? Well, they try to, but it ends up falling flat in several ways. I talked before about things being rushed because of the time wasted on humans, but there's other issues with the romance besides that. In the original, there was no real established social class between the dogs. All of them were pretty much on the same level regardless of where they came from, which made sense since dogs don't have the same customs as humans. But in the remake, they are very straightforward about the social class division among dogs. It's a stupid commentary they try to make about the difference between the autonomy of street life and the orthodox style of a home life, which ends up being pointless as all the dogs in the movie conform to that lifestyle at the end anyway. It weakens the romantic chemistry between Lady and Tramp because they were supposed to be similar in spite of being raised in different lifestyles. Now there's all sorts of differences in their attitude, like Lady acting more uptight and Tramp being more notably selfish. The differences between them are more drastic and systematic, so having them fall in love in a short period of time doesn't feel believable. Even the iconic spaghetti scene feels less passionate and expressive. When the two touch lips in the original, you can see a very clear emotional connection between the two. Lady is all shy and flustered, but she also starts to feel more infatuated with Tramp. She turns back to him with a smile and is flattered by his offering of the meatball. And then they gaze deeply into each other's eyes. It's a really romantic and expressive shot that captivates their growing love. In the remake, when they touch lips, she just turns her head and is like, ugh, I can't believe I just did that. And then they just cut away from them looking into each other's eyes without letting the shot stick. The atmosphere in this scene is just so much weaker than the original. The only thing I can think of that would make it weaker is if they ended up making Tramp less enjoyable by giving him a stupid backstory about how he used to have owners who abandoned him after having a baby.
What a twist!
So now all the time they spent making them argue over each other's lifestyle was a waste of time because Tramp was just saying that as a ruse to cover up his abandonment issues. It doesn't make their romantic chemistry more complex, it just makes it more cliche and boring. And not to mention it makes him a hypocrite several times. Like, remember in the original how he was fond of kids? How he took the time to play with them for a bit in the adoption window? Well, here he's more stuck up and selfish towards them. You'd think he would be more sensitive to this sort of thing since he'd be able to empathize with someone else who went through the same issue of being abandoned by humans. But no, he neglects to share his food with them and only does so out of respect for the hustle. Also, if Tramp has people in town who like him, why does he steal food? This new backstory just makes him more of a jerk, which just makes you question how him and Lady ended up together. Even when Lady gets captured and taken to the pound, he just stands there doing nothing. Go do something! You're not even going to attempt to save your girlfriend? If I was Lady, I would have smacked him so hard the next time we met. So yeah, this movie isn't any good either, especially when compared to the original. It has a huge lack of understanding towards the film it's based on. The pacing is off, the characters are weaker, the romance between Lady and Tramp is boring, and it's mostly just the same story with hardly anything new or unique to help it stand out. It's nowhere near as bad as a lot of the movies ranked below it on this list, but it's still really dull and unappealing. It's harmless but disposable, which I guess is a generous sign that we're finally out of the horrific territory and into the more just bland and easier to tolerate one. Still, this movie is a snore fest, a plate of unsatisfying leftovers in favor of a fresh and more delectable dish.
Keep Aladdin's
Name out your fucking mouth!
Alright, let's get the obvious out of the way first. Will Smith as the genie is dog shit. He had zero chance of being even a 50th as good as Robin Williams' version of the character. Not one person believed this was gonna work. And big shock, it didn't work. He is so garbage compared to the original genie that I'm not even gonna bother breaking it down. I'm just gonna skip over it and delve into other things that Aladdin 2019 is lacking. There are so many ways in which this one falters, from the pacing to the character writing to the special effects. It's completely devoid of the quality of the original. One of the most amazing things about the original Aladdin is how stunning its visuals are. And not simply that it was animated. It was how the filmmakers took advantage of the setting and provided us with beautiful designs and views of everything on screen. The sunlit environments were beautiful, the moonlit views of the city were gorgeous, just the way the world was shrouded in vibrant heat resembling the Arabian setting. It was all so mesmerizing to watch. The movie's world was fun to explore and gave you a sense of adventure as you kept watching. But the remake ends up making it boring with very underwhelming cinematography. There's all sorts of winding camera movements that never allow you to appreciate the atmosphere and just suck you out of the world. And the shots themselves aren't captivating in the slightest. They don't make the city or the Cave of Wonders interesting to explore. They're just generic shots of a city or a cave. They're so sloppy and badly edited together that it makes the movie difficult to keep up with. And strangely enough, the musical numbers have an opposite effect going on from Beauty and the Beast, in that they're surprisingly well choreographed. The dancing, the sweeping camera angles, the fun appealing visuals, and the actors actually do stuff. They're not just standing around doing nothing while looking bored. But while the visuals of the songs are good, the vocal performances and the music are so tone-deaf and terrible. There's more horrific auto-tuning because they casted Will Smith instead of finding someone who can actually sing, and the singing from the other actors lacks the passion that was in the original. The enunciation of the lyrics is so pale and dull it makes you feel confused, like they're singing a completely different song. I guess the orchestra is at least trying, but the range and sound mixing are really dry and uneven. The music and singing of the original was really awe-inspiring. They got people who were capable of good range, and the orchestra was full of jazz and spunk. The remake sounds like it was recorded as part of a high school production. It just doesn't have the same rhythm at all. Another great sin this remake commits is making Jafar, of all villains, painstakingly boring. Jafar in the original, while not as fleshed out as other villains, was a really entertaining antagonist. He had really good banter with Iago, and his design was really slimy and perfectly mirrored his gleefully evil personality. He was completely off his marbles in the best way, and during the climax his villainy exploded into a show-stopping delight of a final battle. This was all made even better by the amazing voice work of Jonathan Freeman, making him sound just as cartoony as he was diabolical. So much of the fun of Jafar came from how they didn't even try to make him compelling. He was just pure over-the-top evil. In comparison, Jafar in the remake is so watered down and boring. I mean, no offense to the actor, I'm sure he's doing his best with what he was given to work with, but the way the character is written is impossible to have fun with. He just doesn't have the same slimy, sleazy attitude the original had, and they end up ruining it by trying to make him compelling. Oh no, he started off as a common thief and had to do a bunch of stuff to rise to a position of power, and tries to do the whole "you and me are the same" thing when explaining this backstory to Aladdin. Jafar in the original was a fun villain because they weren't trying to make him realistic. They just followed the tradition of Saturday morning cartoon villain. The writers just wanted to have fun with how sinister and maniacal they can make him. But when the remake tries to add realism to this type of character, it demotes him into a boring, casual antagonist. He's no longer the same Jafar that filled us with dread and sinister fun. Now he's just some dude. Even after he makes his wish to become an all-powerful sorcerer, he doesn't do jack shit with his magic. In the original, when Jafar wished to become the most powerful sorcerer in the world, things got batshit crazy. He was commanding Genie to turn into a giant and raise the palace out of the earth. He shot Aladdin all the way to the South Pole. He was performing all sorts of dark magic and transformed into a giant snake. He was just so creative with all the stuff he could do. In the remake, all he does is turn Iago into a giant bird and cause a sandstorm. That is the extent of the most powerful sorcerer in the world. What a ripoff. Jafar in the remake has nothing that made the original entertaining. No show, no cunning, no boisterous personality, no nothing. Honestly, the character was more intimidating in Return of Jafar. And as is standard for these remakes, the lively 2D artwork of the original is replaced with horrible CGI. So many of the special effects are extremely rough and badly placed. Half the time they feel the need to use CGI when they don't even need it. Why have all these CGI effects on Will Smith's Genie when he could have just stayed in his human form? Are they trying to be faithful to the original design? Because this is not in any way faithful to the original design. It's ugly as sin. Abu looks especially awful. They did not put any effort into making sure he looked visually appealing. He looks like nightmare fuel from an unfinished PlayStation 3 game. And then there's Jafar after he turns into a genie. Like, you couldn't make this shit any less pleasant if you tried. Seriously, Shark Boy and Lava Girl had better CGI, and that movie was made on a quarter of this remake's budget. How is that possible? The pacing is also terrible. Just like Beauty and the Beast, they made so many elements of the original go by too quickly just so they can put all their time into these bullshit subplots they added to pad out the runtime. The slow, intimidating build-up to the Cave of Wonders in the intro, they just throw it at us with no build-up and it's over in less than a minute. Aladdin and the gang escaping from the cave when Abu touches the treasure, it's all done in like 20 seconds. Aladdin saving Jasmine from a vendor after stealing food, it comes and goes before establishing the danger of her situation. Like in the original, she was about to get her hand cut off. And the new subplots they added are complete bullshit. There's a forced and painfully underdeveloped romance between Genie and one of Jasmine's servants. There's that stupid shit where they tried to make Jafar more compelling and we just went over how that failed. There's a stupid unneeded focus on the politics for how the kingdom works and its relationship with other kingdoms. And worst of all, they had to turn the female lead into a girl boss. Again! There's a whole last song where they try to make Jasmine more empowering and independent, and it doesn't even do jack shit because the song is immediately preceded with Jafar putting her in her place. Who thought this was a good idea? Why do we keep doing this? Can we stop? Can we please stop this trend of turning the female leads into strong, independent girl bosses because you wrongfully perceive the animated versions as bland love interests? Jasmine in the original was already a strong character. She knew when to speak for herself and what she wanted in life. She knew her own worth and wanted someone who accepted her as a person rather than just her title as princess. She was streetwise and capable of doing things without Aladdin helping her. But she was also careless due to her pampered life in the palace. It was a flaw she overcame throughout the movie because spending time with Aladdin allowed her to develop her independence skills. But the remake feels the need to make Jasmine act independent from the very start of the movie. Now her character doesn't undergo any meaningful development. Her character arc doesn't even make sense because she acts like she hates life in the palace, yet she's striving for political power. Unlike the original, where Jasmine doesn't want to be a princess because it kept her from pursuing her passions, here she actively wants to be her father's successor. She wants to be royalty. She wants to be the next sultan. So where's her character development if she just ends up where she started? Why did this aspect of her character even need to be hammered in so much? It was already apparent in the original that Jasmine would be ruling in her father's stead. We didn't need it hitting us over the head all the time like the remake does. And it just creates a whole bunch of plot holes. Because how does she not understand how the economy works by stealing from a vendor while assuming there'd be no consequences if she's so invested in politics? She thinks everyone who's hungry should just get free food? It's not like she was donating the food by paying for it before giving it away. She was literally stealing it. And we're just supposed to assume she's capable of leading a kingdom when she doesn't understand the bare minimum? But oh no, this is a Disney live-action remake where all the female characters have to be turned into girl bosses. Jasmine isn't a strong character unless she shoves it in our faces. She's not a complex character unless we make her rant about how bigoted society is towards women. And that new song about her not wanting to be speechless and silenced doesn't even fit into the story. We already got all that from the rest of her time on screen. So this song doesn't tell us anything new about her character. And it ends up being a waste of time because they put a song about her fighting against being silenced right before she's immediately silenced by Jafar. She doesn't get the empowerment the song was fighting for because she got captured and turned into a damsel in distress the instant the song ended. Aladdin 2019 turns Jasmine into an obnoxious Karen, and they never address her flaws because she ends up becoming Sultan at the end of the movie with no real arc where she learns anything. They tried so hard to make her empowered, but she never does anything throughout the entire movie. All she does is mope and complain while Aladdin does the heavy lifting. The original Jasmine had an actual personality and an actual character arc. This version of Jasmine is an annoying broad. And finally, they ended up making Aladdin a less interesting character. Not as badly as Jasmine, but still bad. The original Aladdin was full of charisma and expression. He was an underdog with a highly relatable personality. He was a humble person while going through an arc about learning to have more confidence in himself. He learns that Jasmine loved him for who he was and didn't have to keep up that whole prince facade. And his chemistry with the genie was fantastic. They related to each other and how they felt trapped in their situations and formed a strong friendship over the course of the story. The character writing and facial expressions made him such a lovable hero. But the remake ends up stripping that away. The actor does not do a good job capturing the same energy. He sounds really monotone and flat with many of his line delivery sounding like something you'd hear in a first draft. And his facial expressions just don't have any brightness to them. For example, during Prince Ali, the original Aladdin was delighted to be a prince. He had a wide smile and had so much confidence in himself. He embraced the attention he was getting, and you could see how the power of the genie was getting to his head. But in the remake, he just kind of sits awkwardly on top of the elephant. Prince Ali is supposed to be a huge spectacle where you see Aladdin fully immersed in his facade with all sorts of fluid body language and blooming facial expressions. But in the remake, he just sort of sits there. It's heavily restrained and strips away the changes his character is going through. They also made him harder to relate to because he comes across as more selfish. In the original, he only steals food because it's what he needs to survive. He only takes the basic essentials, so there was no malice in his thievery. But in the remake, he's shown to steal personal belongings like necklaces and jewelry. He no longer steals what he needs to survive, he's just stealing. He goes from being a clever but likable street rat who just wants to survive, to an overly confident thief with a bland ego. They throw away the entire point of the movie about how Aladdin and Jasmine were separated by a flawed class system, just for the sake of new elements that don't serve their characters. And his falling out with the genie is so forced. In the original, when Aladdin tells Genie he can't wish him free, he shows remorse and guilt about the situation. He apologizes and shows how he's still being affected by his insecurities because of the class system the law was enforcing. But Genie, who puts so much faith in the idea that Aladdin wasn't like any of his other masters, has all of his hopes dashed and shattered. He feels disappointment and anger towards Aladdin, even telling him,
"Fine, I understand. After all, you've lied to everyone else. Hey, I was beginning to feel left out. Now if you'll excuse me, master."
That was a really deep line of dialogue, and the way it's delivered is so raw that you practically feel it. The remake strips all that nuance away by making Aladdin more of a jerk. He acts entitled and selfish, and it just doesn't make him relatable. Aladdin in the original didn't allow being a prince to spoil him, he just wanted a better life. free from having to steal for food and hiding out in a rundown apartment. But oh no, we have to do this stupid thing where he's breaking the genie's heart because he's starting to become more like Jafar, and it's just so tripe and forced. Even his romance with Jasmine feels bland and boring. In the original, they just related to how they felt trapped in their situations, not being able to enjoy life because of how they were always just perceived as what society labeled them as. It was really sweet seeing how the two bonded over this because their connection felt mutual, and it's carried over to a whole new world where Aladdin shows Jasmine all the things she's missing out on. He gives her a chance to see the world and explore her interests, unlike the other suitors who only cared about her title and could only give her stuff she already had as royalty. The romantic atmosphere between them was soothing and soft, and you really bought into their relationship because of how they bonded in such a short time. But because the remake puts so much emphasis in Jasmine wanting to be Sultan, it ruins the romantic atmosphere of the song. It makes the scene pointless because she doesn't want to explore the world anymore. They only end up falling in love now because that's what the story is about. They remove the part where they bond over being trapped and just throw in this dumb backstory about how closed off the palace became after her mom died, which never has an effect on their relationship throughout the entire movie, and all the scenes of them being together are dragged out with really bad attempts at comedy and filler. It just doesn't have the same passion the original had, and the romance feels less developed as a result. I suppose if I wanted to be lenient towards this movie, there are some good things in it. The romance at least feels more developed than Beauty and the Beast. It has good set pieces, some of the actors are pretty good, the dancing and choreography is actually fun to watch. It has some nice vibrant colors, and at the very least there's a level of scope to it compared to a lot of these other remakes. In a sense, I would go so far as to say that in terms of overall quality, it's certainly one of the better live-action remakes, which is really, really sad. But in the end, it's just not a satisfying movie. Nothing is really improved and most of the elements don't lend properly to live action. The new additions aren't properly implemented and it makes the overall pacing feel foamed in. It's just another movie that doesn't need to exist when there's already a much better version. It's a dull and boring carpet ride that I will certainly never take again after this ranking video, and I highly suggest you do the same.
I absolve you of your sins. You have been forgiven.
So to tell the truth, Cinderella 2015 is what I personally consider the true first Disney live-action remake, at least from this era. I know there's Alice in Wonderland and Maleficent that came out first, but those weren't really remakes as much as they were retellings. Cinderella was an actual authentic adaptation of the original story, going with the animated version beat for beat. And surprisingly enough, this is the one that a lot of people consider good or even better than the original. So, does Cinderella manage to break the live-action remake curse and finally provide us with a good one? Well, it's pretty close, but not close enough. I know there's a lot of people who like this one and I can understand why. There are things that this one actually does better than the original. Like, not just as good, but straight up better. The first big thing this movie does is how it gives a lot more character to the prince. In the original, there was no two ways about it. He was just a bland love interest who only got like 3 or 4 lines of dialogue. Even then, he doesn't have any character. He just spends his screen time looking bored and uninterested until he's attracted to Cinderella at the ball. The remake gives him a lot more personality and presence in the story, and dare I say, they even made him a compelling character. They even give him a name in this one. Prince Kit. He actually meets Cinderella before the night of the dance, which creates more of a connection between them. It shows how they built a relationship very early on, and it creates a lot of groundwork for their romance later. Even during the night of the ball, the relationship between them is developed a lot more. They don't just dance while looking into each other's eyes. He gives her a tour of the castle and they talk about their interests. Compared to the original, the romance between Cinderella and the prince feels much more mutual and earned. And it's not just his relationship with Cinderella. The prince also has a really good dynamic with other characters. He has a really touching relationship with his father as it builds up to a really deep heart-to-heart as they say their goodbyes on his deathbed. He has a nice relationship with his servants by relating to them instead of just acting princely. He even takes more initiative in the story by going on the search for Cinderella himself. And when he finds her, he recognizes her for the person he fell in love with instead of who can fit the glass slipper. That's a really wholesome detail that shows how genuine their relationship was. I was actually fascinated by how much better this character is compared to the animated counterpart. He's an actual character now and not just some tool for the story. The movie's production value is also incredible. No cringe CGI, no over-the-top special effects, just practical sets and costumes built around the aesthetic of the original movie. Every costume, every location, every building and model the movie takes place in is beautifully stylized. The ballroom alone is so gorgeous. It's so lush and brimming with life, you feel like you're in this enchanted castle watching all these people dance. The movie is visually satisfying in every way. There's proper composition to how everything is shot, and the use of lighting allows everything to shine with so much finesse. There's so many gorgeous shots in this movie that feel like a painting being brought to life, and there's never a moment where it gets too dark or improperly saturated. And the third thing this remake has over the original is the vastly improved pacing. The original unfortunately had really bad pacing. It takes them 20 minutes to get to the actual plot because of all the time they waste on the mice trying to outsmart the cat. And even when the actual plot kicks off, they still transition to all these hijinks that don't do anything to enhance the story. Some of the stuff with the king and his right-hand man is funny, but it's still just a dragged-out running joke where he wants to retire and have grandkids. It makes a lot of things in the original feel rushed, like Cinderella's non-existent romance with the prince. The remake has solid pacing throughout. There's never a moment where it drags something out for too long or wastes its time on awkward attempts at comedy. There's a really strong focus on the characters, their interactions with each other, the development of the plot, and the framing that's used to tell the story. Even the directing and acting is surprisingly good. Everyone looks invested and takes their roles to heart. They have the proper amount of expression and body language, and they work off the movie cinematography very well. With all these things in mind, I can certainly see why people like this one. This is a Disney live-action remake that, for the most part, notices flaws from the original and works to improve on it, instead of making changes that make the story worse like the other remakes. They give the prince more characterization, it doesn't have horrible CGI, and it has a much more consistent flow with its story. So, do these things make it better than the original? Sadly, no. These are certainly good things in the movie, but where Cinderella 2015 fails is at 3 specific things that were crucial to the story. The first one being Lady Tremaine. The remake tries to make her more compelling by giving her a backstory regarding her relationship with Cinderella's father, which is similar to how it happened in the original story, but they put way too much time in trying to make her tragic. Not to mention, it ends up falling flat as her character becomes increasingly petty. Like, you're treating Cinderella like garbage because her father called you a silver medal to his late wife. That's a really ridiculous motivation for your actions. Because of how laughable her motivation is, they end up dropping the ball and trying to make her sympathetic. They're not even subtle about it. There's literally a scene where she says out loud, "I'm jealous of your beauty, so I don't like you," when she could have just as easily said, "because I said so." That would be more in line with an abusive, controlling parent. Even then, her character gets way too over the top, to the point that she feels more like a cartoon than, well, the actual cartoon. Lady Tremaine in the original was so much more impactful. They simply focused on how evil and spiteful she was towards Cinderella. They knew that any backstory they gave her would be a waste because the extent she goes to make this person miserable are so direct and specific that it makes you hate her malicious nature. But at the same time, that's what made her so entertaining. The original Lady Tremaine is the embodiment of a villain you love to hate. She was evil in a way that was believable and scary. She was a realistic human type of evil, the kind that unfortunately too many people experience every single day. That made Cinderella more relatable and therefore Lady Tremaine more intimidating. She's not as diabolical as someone like Maleficent or Frollo, but her intimidation came in the simplicity of her actions. She just had complete control over one person's life, and she takes advantage of that control to an unsettling degree. And her pettiness didn't have a compelling reason behind it. She was just jealous of Cinderella's youth and beauty. You don't really need more than that. You can just see it in her eyes whenever she glares at Cinderella. This is a wicked woman who simply takes pride in bringing Cinderella down, and it makes her defeat at the end so much more cathartic. I still feel shook whenever I watch the horror of that scene where she sets Cinderella up to have her dress torn apart by her daughters. Not only does she show how much power she had over Cinderella, but it also shows how badly she spoiled her children. And it's made even more cruel when you remember this dress was actually something left for her by her mother. That was the last thing in Cinderella's life that belonged to her, and Lady Tremaine completely destroys it. This is how you make a villain scary without giving them superpowers or making them some sort of serial killer. Stuff like this shows how the original Lady Tremaine was not to be messed with. The remake just has her tug on it twice. Oh, how monstrous. Another problem with the remake is how it makes no sense for Lady Tremaine to mold Cinderella into a servant because when her father dies, she's a grown woman. There's less of a reason for Cinderella to stay with her, and it makes less sense for her to be groomed into this life. In the original, Cinderella's father died when she was still a child. She was at the complete mercy of her stepfamily. That's how Lady Tremaine was able to gaslight her into servitude. The remake's attempt at making Lady Tremaine a tragic widow just feels lazy. It might have worked if they dialed down her cruelty or made it less upfront, but they tried to have it both ways and it doesn't work. They even try to do this stupid thing at the end when Cinderella forgives her and that somehow redeems her. Lady Tremaine's forgiveness is never earned because she never does anything to atone for all the stuff she did to her. And Cinderella just gets over all those years of emotional abuse and trauma like it was just an inconvenience to her. It's like what happened in Steven Universe. The story ends with the hero acting friendly and forgiving towards against the villains that traumatized them and did heinous shit to them when there's no reason for that friendliness and forgiveness. Cinderella doesn't owe her anything. She was an active abuser and Cinderella is her victim. She should have just cut ties with her and left with Kit to start a new life. It's completely forced and makes Cinderella look like a huge doormat. Speaking of which, this is the second major thing that the remake gets horribly wrong. It all starts with that stupid advice her mom gives her before she passes away, how she must always have courage and be kind to others. Now, this is not inherently bad advice. It's important for children to learn about courage and kindness at a young age to help with their development. The problem is that the remake takes it far too literally. Being courageous and kind doesn't mean just allowing yourself to be a punching bag. That would have been a great lesson for Cinderella to learn. That there are people in the world who don't deserve kindness because they just chose to treat you like garbage for no justifiable reason. She spends so much of the movie acting like an idiot who lives in another reality half the time, and she just chooses to stay in this abusive relationship. She can easily leave and go somewhere else. What, because she doesn't want to leave the house her father owned? She leaves it at the end to live with the prince in the castle anyway. She had a reasonably healthy childhood while living with her father, so why does she allow herself to be abused like this? You don't feel any hopelessness in her situation because it's all artificial. She can leave at any time but just openly chooses to stay. She does nothing to get away from her abuse, so why should I feel for the situation? She just lives in a dream world completely blind to reality. The original Cinderella was not this stupid and naive. The worst part is when she gets locked in the attic, which is really badly done compared to the original. The original had a suspenseful build-up to it. It had creepy music and that sinister glare from Lady Tremaine. The slow pacing and atmosphere helped the danger feel real, and Lady Tremaine locks her in there so quickly that Cinderella didn't have time to react. But in the remake, Cinderella just allows herself to get locked up. She could have easily avoided it by playing along with Tremaine's plan and then go psych after she was outside the room. And you know what she does after getting locked in? She just goes back into her fantasy land and fantasizes about dancing with the prince. What is this bullshit? The original Cinderella actually made an effort to free herself. She was shouting for help and banging on the door and working with her animal friends to direct her escape. The original Cinderella took action and initiative. This Cinderella just waits for the problem to magically solve itself. That is horrible writing that thoroughly butchers her character. And before you go, oh, but the original Cinderella wasn't a good character either, allow me to go into the third thing this movie botched up. The message. The story of Cinderella isn't about finding love or living out a fairy tale. It's about working through hardship and escaping from an abusive household. It's about holding on to hope and remaining positive no matter how horrible your situation seems. And that was something the original masterfully told through Cinderella herself. The original Cinderella is a great role model, but a lot of people wrongfully accuse her of being a do-nothing character for not being as active as other Disney female leads. You know, the same thing they said about Snow White. Cinderella is one of my favorite Disney princesses because while she's in a terrible situation, she's always optimistic and kind. Her strength in the original was despite Lady Tremaine making her life a living hell, she was still able to stay positive and kind-hearted. She endured so much abuse from her stepfamily, yet she's still able to keep a cheerful attitude and show compassion to those who deserve it. Cinderella's character arc is her unrelenting pursuit of happiness. How no matter how bad things get for her, she always keeps her chin up and remains hopeful. She just wants to be happy, and we as the audience want to see her happy because she deserves it. And she's not a doormat throughout the movie. She's actually self-aware of her situation and puts forth an effort to stand up for herself. She tries to object to Lady Tremaine making her redo a chore she just did. She manages to outsmart her by addressing how every maiden in the kingdom is allowed to go. And like I said before, she actually directed her escape when she was locked in the attic. What makes Cinderella work is her unrelenting willpower. A lot of people in her situation would have most likely given up and succumbed to it, but Cinderella manages to pull through by simply putting up with it and making efforts to try and escape. This was the underlining message the story was trying to tell us. No matter how your heart is grieving, if you keep on believing. Cinderella never gave up on the reality that she deserved better than what her stepfamily was doing to her. She knew they were toxic and persevered in a situation she was trapped in. No matter what they did, she never broke. There were times in the movie she was vulnerable, like the aftermath of her dress being destroyed, but she still found a way to pull herself back together. Even the fairy godmother said it herself. If Cinderella actually lost all hope, she wouldn't have come to her aid. She grew up above her aggressors and was able to heal and start a new life. That's what made her a strong, independent character. Her undying optimism even after years of emotional and psychological abuse. At the end of the movie, she isn't patting herself on the back for begging a prince and becoming a princess. She's simply healing and moving on. Still the same kind, quietly strong woman who could never be broken. That's what the original was about. But in the remake, the movie ends with a hastily slapped in I forgive you when Lady Tremaine spent the entire movie treating Cinderella like garbage. It makes Cinderella out to be a doormat while completely changing the moral of the story. The original Cinderella is about keeping your chin up and holding on to the hope that things will get better no matter what life throws at you. A very mature and universal lesson that everyone should take to heart. The remake is about always treat others with kindness regardless of how horribly they treated you. That is the most basic preschool theme in the entire world. And it's actually pretty toxic when you think about how the movie delivers that message. Honestly, this one really frustrates me because it was so close to getting it right. In many ways, it is an improvement over the original, but in other ways it's also worse. The original Lady Tremaine was a deeply intimidating and sinister villain. This one is not. The original Cinderella was a strong character and an amazing role model. She's an emotionally abused young woman with no prospects in life and nowhere to go who still managed to be positive and hold on to the hope of getting away from her abusive family. This Cinderella is none of those things. The original movie had a very adult message about perceiving through hardship and staying mentally tough through hard times. This movie does not. I do respect it for improving elements like the prince and the pacing while also not having any shitty CGI, but I just can't give it a pass. The areas it messed up in ultimately hold it back from being the true successor to the original it could have been. It was really close, but sadly not close enough. Still, it is a huge improvement over many of these remakes, which after all the shit I had to put up with in this video is a massive breath of fresh air. If this keeps up, we might just find that one good one that breaks the curse. So let's move forward from this daydream and see what's coming up next.
Oh no! A tiger!
Alright, after all this time we're finally here. The Jungle Book 2016. This is the one that everyone gushes over when it comes to how good these remakes can get. This is the one that finally managed to reach that reputation of being a great remake. One that everyone thinks is not only as good as the original, but better. So you might think I feel the same way, right? Well, yes and no. Now don't get me wrong. This movie had to do something right to make it this high on the list, and in many ways, it is better than the original. The first thing it gets right is the CGI. A lot of the other remakes did not care to put any time into properly rendering the special effects in their movies, resulting in everything looking completely fake. The Jungle Book 2016 actually puts time into rendering everything, resulting in CGI animals that actually look organic and lively. They have really good expressions without being too cartoony or breaking their models, and the textures and other details on them are also very well done. The individual hairs of fur, the body language, the eyes, and the general movements of the animals are all very satisfying to watch. The set pieces and cinematography are also great. Much like Cinderella, this movie takes the time to make sure that everything looks properly polished, giving us all sorts of great views of the jungle and the temple and even the man village. Everything looks beautiful and the movie has really good editing behind it, allowing you to feel immersed in the atmosphere of everything on screen. There's all sorts of sweeping shots of the lush plant life, grand views of the wildlife, and it's all properly lit and saturated, giving everything a proper mix of color. I also really like how they gave Shere Khan more of a presence in the story instead of just having him show up 2 or 3 times. He feels much more diabolical by killing the head of the wolf pack and asserting dominance while indoctrinating the pups. It shows how petty and maniacal he gets in his obsession with Mowgli. It's also really good how the remake actually establishes some sort of relationship between him and Mowgli by having them meet from the very start, instead of just the last 10 minutes like in the original. A lot of people like the original Shere Khan for his limited presence and how it makes him more mysterious and intimidating with how the movie builds him up, but the problem is that he ends up looking like a pushover at the end of the movie. Apparently he's so weak that he can't maul a bear to death, and then he's easily outwitted by Mowgli and gets scared off before he even gets 10 minutes of screen time. There's also a lack of a relationship between the hero and the villain because, like I said before, he and Mowgli don't even meet until the last 10 minutes. It makes the final battle less tense and sort of underwhelming. In the remake, Shere Khan is a constant presence looming over Mowgli and his shadow lingers over most of the film. By having the two come face to face from the start, it creates more of a dynamic between the hero and the villain, and it also creates a greater sense of danger for Mowgli by showing how he can be attacked at any time. Although I will admit, it sort of weakens Shere Khan's integrity as a villain by making it that he just hates humans out of prejudice instead of any real fear. The idea is that man is supposed to be forbidden in the jungle because it upsets the balance of nature and they're notorious for hunting and killing animals. But this version of Shere Khan attacks and kills humans completely unprovoked. That scar he got over his eye, that was his own fault for attacking Mowgli's father for no reason. While I do like how they give him more presence and make him more menacing, his motivations are extremely weak, and it can get in the way of how we're supposed to see him as a threat. Ka the snake is also way more scary and intimidating than her animated counterpart. This creature is like something out of a mythological legend. The scene with her is paced out really well, creating a great sense of tension and danger, and the aura she emits fills you with so much dread. In spite of being a one-shot villain, she actually makes a stronger impression than Shere Khan. The cold stare she gives as she looks into Mowgli's eyes, the slow menacing way she takes time with her prey, her soft alluring voice as she prepares to devour him, she just oozes with menace. Although I have to ask, why did they make her a girl in this version? Is this just something Disney likes to do with talking animals? They also take the time to expand on Mowgli's relationship with other animals, from Baloo to Bagheera to the wolf pack to even the elephants. The original was sort of an anthology in how Mowgli would interact with these animals. He has a scene with them, he does some stuff with them, and then he moves on to the next animal. It works as a series of fun little events as he explores the jungle, but it doesn't allow him to develop a connection with anyone outside of Baloo. But the remake greatly expands on Mowgli's chemistry with the jungle animals. This is one of the few Disney live-action remakes that actually takes advantage of its longer runtime, using it to develop the characters and how they work off each other. Bagheera is a really good foil to Mowgli as he believes it's best for him to live among man. But the remake takes its time to flesh out his character a bit more. He's an overly stern mentor who cares about Mowgli and wants what's best for him, but he also has an arc about accepting and understanding Mowgli for who he is, and why he might have a place in the jungle. He looks out for his safety, but he also understands the situation better. And Baloo, while not as iconic and charismatic as the original, is still a pretty fun companion to Mowgli. It gets the core of the character down pretty accurately with his lazy and easygoing outlook on life, just trying to enjoy the pleasures of it on his own terms. And the friendship he develops with Mowgli feels more mutual, unlike the original where they just instantly bonded after one song. They start off pretty rocky with Baloo annoying him and Mowgli not liking him very much, but they start to warm up to each other and hit it off pretty well. They develop a genuine understanding of each other, talking about Mowgli finding his own place in the jungle, connecting over getting by on their own, and even talking about Mowgli making an independent choice to go to the man village. And while it's brief and not shown a lot, you can see the connection that Mowgli has with his adopted wolf family. They show how Mowgli develops skills to live among them and how he learned to adapt to their lifestyle, and he has some nice bonding moments with the pups and their mom. I especially admire the motherly instinct of Raksha, having a really strong and authentic bond with Mowgli in spite of him not being part of their own kind. It feels akin to a lot of stories about animals who take in children that aren't theirs, and when they part ways, you feel bad about it because there is a sense of establishment in how they interacted as a family. Also, the production value of this one is insane. It's so mind-blowing how the crew managed to take all these blue screens while combining them with practical effects, and managed to come up with something this visually spectacular. All these different tools and techniques and how they were utilized in a way that makes the world of the movie feel this believable and intrinsic. It's without question the most masterful of the live-action remakes when it comes to the visuals, and you can really see how it was made possible by the astounding time that was put into its production. And lastly, this version of Mowgli is very well written. Maybe not well acted, but that's for later. The original Mowgli was okay. He worked fine as the main character of a coming-of-age story, but he was also pretty one-dimensional in terms of actual personality. The only characters he had any real chemistry with were Baloo and King Louie, and even then, it's only because they work off his naive nature. He was also pretty bland in that he just decides to leave his life in the jungle behind because he was smitten by a pretty-looking girl he had absolutely no relation with. There's no dialogue, no interaction, no indication that these two are a thing. It's literally just them staring into each other's eyes and then he shrugs like, well, that's life. This version of Mowgli feels more fleshed out, because they focus on the fact that he's a human raised in the wild. He's actually really smart, using all sorts of ingenuity and survival skills in order to get the essentials he needs. And there's actually times where he learns and improves upon his skills. For example, the first time he gets honey from Baloo, he just kicks at it with no protection from the bees. And the next time he does it, he tries to do it safer. He uses leaves as a protection suit from the bees, and he creates a saw from some plants and uses that to cut the honey more easily. That's a really clever display of problem-solving skills. It shows us how he survived in the jungle all these years by allowing us to see how he's capable of utilizing his environment and adapting to different situations. But they also maintain that element of him being a wild child that's mystified by human civilization. The first time he sees fire up close feels like how he would actually experience it for the first time, and the movie shows it like how we're seeing it from his point of view. Fire is supposed to be mythological and alien to residents of the jungle, and seeing it like this feels like how someone who doesn't understand it would actually perceive it. So in a lot of ways, this remake actually does feel like it's much better than the original. Not only does it establish the setting of the jungle more than the original, it also establishes the core characters much more. It takes time to show why Mowgli would feel like he belongs in the jungle and the animal characters are far more refined. So with all these things in mind, you'd think this would be the Disney live-action remake that manages to be a good good movie with no glaring issues, right? Well, remember how I said yes and no in the beginning? The thing about that is, the only reason why it's possible for The Jungle Book 2016 to be better than the original is because, in full honesty, the original was pretty mediocre. It's not a bad movie, but compared to so many of Disney's other animated movies, it's really lacking in plot development and character. The best part of the original was actually the music and the songs. These were pretty good musical numbers and fantastic jazz orchestras that carried the movie more than anything else. So yeah, The Jungle Book 2016 is better than the original, but only because it's not really that hard. So as you can imagine, it means this one has some pretty big problems when you look past its strengths. The first glaring one is that the kid playing Mowgli is really not a good actor. His line deliveries are weak, his facial expressions are lacking, and his body language just doesn't feel like it's being properly directed. It ends up being a huge distraction from the actual character writing because the way the actor plays him just doesn't feel convincing. Another problem is how this version of King Louie is a gargantuan ape who looks like he's a huge threat, and yet somehow he's not the villain of the film. Everyone talks about how much of a threat Shere Khan is, but no one is talking about the 60-foot orangutan who's casually smashing his way through ancient temples. Like, they set up this character to be really menacing, and then they don't do anything with him. He really would have made for a much more interesting and threatening villain than Shere Khan, with his army of monkeys and desire to evolve. There's also some pretty bad renditions of classic songs, with Bare Necessities and I Wanna Be Like You being covered very poorly by Will Ferrell and Christopher Walken. Honestly, the songs end up feeling really intrusive because there's only 2 of them carried over from the original. The original had 6 songs which made them feel fitting as it was meant to be a musical, but the remake only has 2. What's the point of incorporating the original soundtrack if you're not gonna go all the way with it? The remake wasn't meant to be a musical, so having musical numbers results in bad pacing. Then you have the final battle, which is so stupid on so many levels. I don't care how strong and durable tigers are. This guy is getting bum rushed by a panther, a pack of wolves, and a bear. The bear alone should have one-shot the tiger. Like, I shouldn't have to explain to you how physically strong a fully grown adult bear is. This fight should have been over in like 10 seconds. But because they need to make Mowgli the one who fights him for no real reason, they end up dragging it out for another 5 minutes. Not to mention Shere Khan turns into a huge dumbass at the end. Like, seriously, he's just aimlessly charging into a forest fire with no plan? Isn't this guy supposed to be scared of fire or something? They took away all the menace he had in the first and second act and just turned him into a generic boring brute, who's easily outwitted when he previously displayed more cunning. And finally, the biggest problem is that the story doesn't end with Mowgli going to the man village like he's supposed to. The Jungle Book is supposed to be about Mowgli coming to terms with the fact that he needs to be with his own kind. Even though he was raised in the wild, he doesn't really belong there. He has to accept himself as a human being and live among man. The Chuck Jones version understood this by having him part ways with the jungle. It was about establishing the balance of nature and how everything needs to be in a certain place to maintain that balance. I just don't get what it is with these live-action remakes of The Jungle Book never ending with Mowgli returning to the village to become a man. It ends up taking away from the original message the book was going for. The 2016 movie provides a good setup for this, but then there's no payoff. Mowgli caused harm to the jungle by bringing the red flower and destroying the environment. This would have been the moment where he comes to terms with his nature as a human. After the final battle, he would say his goodbyes to his animal friends and then go to the man village to live with his own kind. That would be a nice bittersweet ending in tune with the original story. But no, we have to keep Mowgli in the jungle because reasons. One other thing to bring up is how the movie does end up having a pacing problem halfway through. It goes through him leaving the wolf pack pretty fast and then it sort of slows down too much. There's a lot of things that feel like they end up getting too much screen time. The confrontation with King Louie, Shere Khan taking over the wolf pack, and the backstory explaining how Mowgli started living in the jungle. There's stuff like this all over the movie where the story ends up kinda stopping for a while and it results in things getting kinda boring. So yeah, the movie is alright, but it's not as good as it could have been. There's just been a lot of adaptations of this story over the years, and with so many of them, it's hard to find one that's faithful to the book. The Jungle Book 2016 feels like it's trying to be less like the book and more like the animated movie, so I can see how it would falter in some ways. But still, it does do plenty of things right. It certainly has the most rewatch value of any of these remakes I've talked about so far, and its positive reception is very well deserved. But if you asked me if I would rather watch this or several of Disney's animated classics, I would still choose the animated classics because they're miles above this. Overall, it's not a bad remake and it definitely has a lot of good stuff. It's just not the top tier movie everyone says it is. But hey, if it means the movies I talk about from this point forward aren't insufferable garbage, who am I to argue?
Tarzan, the ape man.
So, wow. Looking through the list of movies Disney remade from their old classics, I didn't even know this one existed. When people think about the Disney live-action remake of The Jungle Book, they usually think of the 2016 version, completely forgetting that Disney already did this back in 1994. A movie written and directed by Stephen Sommers, who's actually made some pretty big hits like The Mummy and... Actually, no, that's about it. It's actually pretty interesting to see that this was something Disney was doing before it even became a trend, remaking their classic movies in live action. In fact, this was actually the first one Disney ever made. But the big question is it a good movie? Well, in a strange way, it is a good movie, but it manages to be good without actually being anything like the original. In fact, it's practically a completely different plot. The stuff with Mowgli being raised in the jungle takes place within the first 15 minutes. Everything after that happens after he's grown into a man, and it seems to take place during the British colonization of India. It makes for an interesting setup while also implementing some historical elements that weren't present in the animated version. To be honest, it has a fairly simple plot. The hero meets a girl, they have a relationship, there's a villain looking for treasure, they travel into the jungle where they find this ancient tomb of riches, and they have to fight a bunch of dangers along the way. It sounds kind of like an Indiana Jones movie when you put it that way. But while the plot itself is pretty simple, the other qualities of the movie are incredibly complex. The first phenomenal thing about the movie is its production value. This was a time before filmmakers started using CGI as a shortcut for any sort of practicality in the effects. And honestly, it's so much better for it. Every single thing in this movie is extremely visually satisfying. The costumes, the jungle, the Indian village, and even the animals. The set pieces alone are incredible. Every location this movie takes place in feels really authentic. Like, it actually feels like it was shot in some sort of ancient temple or out in the wild jungle. It might not be complex, but every setting and background element of the movie just looks really pleasant while having a proper atmosphere to it. The lush colors of the jungle, the sunlit Indian city, the dark shadowy dungeon, the crumbling architecture of the temple, it makes the mood of the entire movie feel more adventurous and exciting. There's very minor use of CGI in this movie, and everything is done with blue screen and actual on-screen animals. And the stuff they do with the animals is amazing. None of them talk like they do in other adaptations, yet they manage to get so much emotion and expression across. The ways in which they interact with Mowgli and the other human characters is so authentic and believable. The level of training and direction they gave them is truly outstanding. They look fully focused, their attention is on the right stuff, and by using real animals instead of CGI, it makes so many of the movie's more emotional moments much more impactful. That scene where Mowgli is crying while gripping onto a wounded Baloo feels real because everything on screen is real. That's not a computer effect. That's a real animal the actor is interacting with. This is the kind of thing you just can't replicate with CGI. It adds so much authenticity to what's going on because of how they took the time to train real animals for these roles. Like, nowadays they would make all the animals CGI just to save time and money. It just doesn't have the same spark of creativity. Having the animals not talk in this movie is also a great way to give it more distinction from other adaptations. You have to recognize what they're feeling by reading the facial expressions and body language. It feels much more interesting that way. Their roles in the movie are also pretty good. The ways in which they bond with Mowgli are very well directed, and several characters like Shere Khan are even given new roles. I honestly really love what they did with him here, making him less of a villain and more of a tiger that's just protecting his territory. It's also really interesting how they made him an enforcer of the laws of the jungle, someone who actually cares about maintaining that balance of nature instead of just being a killer. Even in the movie, the humans speak of him as a legend. They actually refer to him as a keeper of the jungle. It feels like he's adhering to the laws of the jungle instead of just hating man. A guardian who's very strict about them and how he'll hunt down anyone who breaks this code. They also made Ka more interesting. This huge anaconda who guards this treasure room and kills anyone who trespasses his territory. He doesn't have a single line of dialogue, yet they managed to make him so menacing and intimidating. The animals are a huge highlight of the movie in spite of not being central characters. The ways in which the team utilized them and trained them to do all these things without a single line of dialogue is an incredible display of commitment. They really cared about making this movie feel as authentic as possible with how the animals were used, and anything with them makes the movie much more mesmerizing to see. But it's not just the animals. The human characters are fun too. They actually got a really strong cast to play these roles, and some of these names are actually a pretty big deal. Sam Neill, Jason Scott Lee, Carrie Elways, John Cleese. They even managed to get Lena Headey in this. All these people would move on to much bigger products that would make them more widely known. So it's interesting to watch this movie as we get to see early stages of their career and how they would evolve. And all of them look so committed to their roles while having so much fun with this movie. Everyone on screen looks like they're having a good time and just enjoying each other's company. It makes the performances much more entertaining and energized. The villain, played by Carrie Elways, is a ton of fun. He just chews up every scene he's in. He brings so much sincerity to the role where he's the right amount of over the top and subtle. He's allowed to be funny while also being really intimidating. There's just so much enjoyable hamminess to his performance. But the best actor in the movie by far is Jason Scott Lee as Mowgli. He ends up carrying a lot of the movie on his shoulders, and he does it with so much finesse and focus. He perfectly captures the naivety of someone who was raised in the jungle. He's cautious but also curious of all the weird things he's experiencing. The scene where he meets Kitty for the first time since they were separated is really well paced, with him observing her and circling her to get an assessment of how he should feel. Something about his performance just perfectly captures a sense of gentleness. It comes across as really innocent and pure. His body language and the way he emotes is very transparent, and he manages to pull off this performance very well with very little dialogue. Most of his character is done through facial expressions and how he physically interacts with the animals and humans. And he does such a good job acting out this wild man who has to learn about adapting to a strange new world. There's a scene early on in the movie where he enters the treasure room and he finds a dagger. Then he looks at the art on the wall depicting a fight between a man and a tiger. He then tries to mimic the man with his shadow looming over it, and it's a fantastic piece of direction. It shows how Mowgli is tapping into his human roots without a single line of dialogue, all through pure body language and curious facial expressions. A lot of Jason's scenes are like this, where he's able to express a wide range of humanity and emotion in everything he does while on screen. And it's miles better than the kid who played Mowgli in the 2016 movie. Lena Headey as Kitty is also pretty well done. She has a nice sense of humor and sarcasm to her role while also having a lot of cheerful chemistry with Mowgli. I really appreciate how they establish a relationship between them beforehand, so it's not just them knowing each other for a couple of hours before they get together. They were old friends who got separated from each other when they were little and met up years later, having taken different paths in life, much like Simba and Nala from The Lion King. It establishes a mutual connection between them beforehand and a deeper bond and closeness to each other before they reunite. There's an enjoyably slow pace to their relationship, taking its time to build up their friendship and romance by having them relate to each other and connect through shared interests. It's also really good how the two manage to interact with each other without Scott using any dialogue, only communicating with Lena using body language and expression. Another great thing about this movie is how it manages to establish a very even tone. It never gets too lighthearted or too dark. It manages to maintain a proper middle ground between the two. It creates tension and drama without being heavy-handed about the darker elements of the movie. And that's saying a lot because there's actually some pretty harsh deaths. There's the quicksand one, the villain getting mauled by a tiger, one of them getting crushed in the tomb. It really feels like the kind of deaths you would see in an Indiana Jones movie. But the deaths are actually pretty tame for what they ended up showing. There's no blood and gore or anything like that. It's just the villain dying and the movie going, oh, well, they're dead. So they never offset the mood by being too gritty. The pacing is also extremely tight. It never wastes time on boring exposition or long-winded scenes with the characters doing nothing. Everyone gets the right amount of screen time with none of them overshadowing each other. It allows the story to develop on even ground so you're never hit with too much at one time. There's even an entire portion of the movie with no dialogue. It's just Mowgli interacting with the jungle animals, establishing the atmosphere of the jungle and his relationship with his animal friends. They even take the time to show some of his quick wit and survival skills. Even the music is really, really good. It perfectly sets the mood of every scene with a proper tone. And it's even better during scenes with no dialogue, showing Jason's acting abilities without saying anything. Going into this one, I didn't expect the movie to be bad. It looked cool, but I didn't think it would do anything to impress me. What I wasn't prepared for was how surprisingly good it turned out to be. Just about every important element to the story is great, with a lot of care being put into how it plays out. The pacing is tight, it never gets too light or too dark, the characters have really good chemistry, the acting is superb, the animals are fantastic, the production value is impressive, the visuals are beautiful and mesmerizing, and it explores the themes about man upsetting the balance of nature without being in your face about it. So you'd think this would be the perfect live-action remake, right? The one that finally breaks the curse. Well, I don't know if I can say that for sure. Now don't get me wrong, this movie is still really, really good. But there's a number of ways it falters as a remake. The first one being the really out-of-place comedy. I get this is a Disney production, so there has to be some kind of lighthearted stuff thrown in there to keep younger audiences invested, but the jokes and humor kind of offset the mood of many scenes. The movie is trying to be a more action-adventure type of story, which means the comedy can end up interfering with more tense scenes, like when Mowgli is being held captive or being chased by the villains. It's sprinkled throughout moments in the movie that stall time and keep scenes going longer than they would. It doesn't happen too much, but when it does, it has a really bad habit of dragging you out of the experience. Another issue is that the movie unfortunately does take a bit of a nosedive when they start getting to the parts where everyone is talking and Mowgli starts using language. The silent moments were just so majestic and expressive. It was an actual actual motion picture that used visuals to tell its story by letting us absorb the emotions of the characters through their actions and expressions. It just fit Mowgli's character so much better instead of making him talk or do stuff the other human characters do. Something that made the first act so successful at sucking you into the world. It still has a good story and characters, but it feels less unique after they start talking and making Mowgli more civilized. And finally, and unfortunately this is the movie's biggest problem, it really doesn't feel like an adaptation of The Jungle Book. Like, when you think of The Jungle Book, you think about Mowgli going through a coming-of-age story. You think of him coming to terms with his nature as a human being and going to live among men. You think about the movie exploring his place in the jungle with the characters debating if he belongs there. Well, this movie is none of those things. It's literally just The Jungle Book in name only. It has absolutely no connection with the source material because of how removed it is from the original book. Even the animated movie had more in common with the original book. This looks like it's trying to be its own thing and it just uses the Jungle Book name to grab people's attention. While looking into some of the movie's background, I actually learned that it wasn't a purely Disney movie. In fact, it originally wasn't going to be a Disney movie at all. They just randomly approached Steven during production and got involved, which would explain the out-of-place humor. This feels less like an adaptation of The Jungle Book and more like an adaptation of Tarzan. And if that's really the case, why call it The Jungle Book at all? When you think of The Jungle Book, you think of something like the Chuck Jones short or even the original animated Disney movie. Those adaptations were about Mowgli as a boy and exploring his relationship with the jungle. This movie is more like an Indiana Jones-style treasure hunt, but with a main character named Mowgli while having animal friends named after Baloo and Bagheera and so forth. It just doesn't feel like The Jungle Book at all, which kinda makes the movie come across as false advertising. Were they trying to be more original by telling the story with Mowgli as an adult instead of a boy? Well, if that's what they wanted to do, they could have named it something else that would be more accurate to the plot. They could have named it something like The Adventures of Mowgli, or Mowgli and the Forbidden Temple, or The Jungle Book Mowgli Returns. Just something to indicate that it was going to be a different plot from what they were advertising. But who am I kidding? Even with these problems, it's still a fun movie. It still has really good acting, story, characters, visuals, pacing, themes, and music. This is easily one of Disney's best hidden gems, and I do feel bad that more people don't know about it. It only made about $70 million at the box office, and since then, Disney hasn't really done anything to advertise it. Even if it's not what I would consider a faithful adaptation of The Jungle Book, it's still a really entertaining movie with plenty of rewatch value. I still find myself really impressed with the acting Scott pulled off here. His performance in this movie is really emotive and joyful. I really don't think he was just performing for a movie. He genuinely looks like he was having a good time here. His acting alone makes this movie worth watching, and all of the movie's other great elements just make it a guaranteed fun time. It's the first time throughout this entire list that I can confidently say that it's actually a very good movie, which for the Disney live-action remakes is a mind-blowing achievement. But this leaves me asking one question. If this version of The Jungle Book is a #1, and this version of The Jungle Book is a #1, what could possibly be the best Disney live-action remake? Well, let's find out.
It's time for the moment you've been waiting for.
Who would have thunk it? Standing in the #1 spot of the Disney live-action remakes is none other than the 1996 remake of 101 Dalmatians. It's really no surprise that its quality dwarfs all the others. This one is more than worthy of the #1 spot because holy hell, it does not have the right to be this charming. This is a remake that gets everything right. The characters, the story, the atmosphere, the charm, the tone, the villain, the humor, the training of the animals. It is unfathomable how much this movie succeeds as a remake, to the point that I'm actually surprised it aged so well after all these years. And the biggest reason for it is Glenn Close as Cruella de Vil. She embodies the insanity of the character to a perfect T and knocks it out of the ballpark. The introduction alone lets you know how entertaining she's gonna be. It's a slow, methodical entrance of her exiting her car, entering the building, and making her way to Anita before her face is revealed. On paper, it doesn't sound like a lot, but but the way it's shot and the slow pace to how everything is done makes it so intimidating and threatening. The atmosphere is really daunting as the camera focuses on her feet, slowly panning around her costume as she makes her way through the halls. The music is enjoyably creepy, adding more weight to her presence and making you feel more anxious for that slow, dramatic reveal. The cinematography also keeps just the right distance from her, allowing you to feel uneased by her without revealing too much. Until finally, Anita turns around and there she is, Glenn Close with that shit-eating grin. And from there, it is one of the greatest performances you will ever see in a 90s movie. This woman owns this role in a way that no human being could possibly replicate. She perfectly understands what Cruella de Vil is supposed to be. Crazy, scary, malicious, nefarious, bombastic, narcissistic, without an ounce of subtlety to everything she does. I love how the first action she takes in the entire film is just butting cigarette ash on someone's shoe. That is so emblematic of how she views herself as above the people around her, and everything after that is such a delight to see unfold. Glenn Close takes one of the most wicked villains in Disney's rogues gallery and makes her so entertaining to watch. She's so imperial in her behavior that even taking a drawing from someone has to sound diabolical, and making her Anita's boss is such a brilliant change. It makes her more intimidating by holding power over one of the main characters and taking advantage of her talent. At first she seemed to genuinely admire Anita's work by complimenting her design for a coat, and then it's revealed she's gonna use it as inspiration for her Dalmatian coat. It leads to a situation where Anita has to look this crazy woman dead in the eye and deny her what she wants. You can really sense the fear she must have been feeling when she told Cruella no. Speaking of which, this movie is really faithful to how petty this character is. Like, we all know she could have just as easily gotten the remaining 15 puppies somewhere else. Much like the original, it wasn't about buying the puppies. It was about holding power over Roger and Anita. They dared to deny her what she wanted, and now she's gonna get back at them one way or another. And Glenn Close really captures how this would play out in live action. The whole tearing up the check and storming out of the house in a fit of rage while vowing to get even. It is such a Cruella de Vil thing for her to do. And even after that, there's so many amazing things about this performance. Her dialogue is so enjoyably egotistical and snarky while also having a dark humor to it. Like this one where she apologizes to Anita for getting pregnant with Roger's child, and then complimenting how they've been busy with Pongo and Perdita having children. Stuff like this is all across her script, and her line deliveries are perfectly cheeky. She sounds intimidating but also passionate with every word she says. It's sort of like Heath Ledger's Joker. It's really removed from what we usually expect from the character as the actor makes it their own thing. But by God does it work. Glenn Close's idea for acting out Cruella de Vil was to just go nuts. And she's an entire harvest of nuts in this movie. Everything from her body language to her facial expressions is an absolute delight. She translates so much energy into this character that other actors wouldn't be able to do. This is exactly how I'd imagine a live-action version of Cruella de Vil would look like. A middle-aged woman with over-the-top hair and all these crazy looks on her face like she's about to transform into a slasher movie villain. They even take the time to flesh out her character a bit more by delving into things like her personal life and her psyche. She's more diabolical by killing exotic animals from zoos and wearing their hides like a rug while smothering them like they're a house pet. That is so messed up, but also so in tune with the character. And then there's the iconic laugh. Like, oh my goodness, how can you not love her villain laugh? I cannot get enough of how this woman might just have one of the greatest villain laughs I've ever seen in a movie. The maniacal look on her face combined with the sniveling cackle in her vocals is so deliciously evil, and it ends up making you feel like you're going as crazy as she is. The best demonstration of this is that scene where she's reveling in the idea of wearing Anita's dogs after capturing the puppies. The steady build-up as she chuckles, the ominous cinematography as she stands in the shadows between those angel statues, the explosive crescendo in the music as she hops in place before throwing her head back and unleashing all the insanity locked away in her brain. It is such a marvelous scene. I swear to God, all I have to do is keep gushing over all the great things about Glenn Close in this movie, and that would be enough to justify this movie's place in the #1 spot. This is without a doubt one of the greatest casting decisions I've ever seen in my life. Every time she's on screen, the movie just falls to her command. The overwhelming amount of craziness in her performance is too much to handle, yet you can never get tired of it. I'm sure a lot of people would prefer the original Cruella for being more soft-spoken and reserved, but I just can't help it. This version of Cruella is a masterclass in villainy. This is the role that Glenn Close was born to play. She's a complete lunatic without an ounce of sympathy in her bones, and she looks like she's having so much fun with this performance. Watching this again really helps to exemplify why the Emma Stone movie failed. because over the top is exactly what was needed for the character. The movie really sells you on the idea that Cruella de Vil is a diabolical rich person obsessed with fur, and her methods are unapologetically cruel while she relishes in how diabolical she is. It makes the character feel more realistic, being villainous in more true-to-life ways compared to most other Disney villains. We love Cruella de Vil for how obsessive and insane she is, stopping at nothing to get her hands on anything furry and fashionable, and Glenn Close perfectly understands how to portray her. She did something that most of the other remakes failed to do right. She made the character fun and expressive with so much charisma, to the point that it feels like the cartoon came to life and just jumped out of the screen. I just don't know what else to say. This woman just embodies one of Disney's most outrageous villains to a flawless T. She is the breakout character of the film. The one that absolutely everyone loves. Like, even people who don't like this movie have more than likely watched this performance and said to themselves, oh yeah, she's amazing. Every second she's on screen just elevates the quality of the movie so much. She's funny, scary, diabolical, expressive, passionate, insane, and the movie perfectly understands her character by never trying to make her sympathetic or tragic. Just evil for the love of the game. She is everything you can possibly want in a villain. But even putting aside Glenn Close, the other aspects of the movie are good too. They expand on other characters while staying in tune with how they were written in the original. Roger and Anita are really good. There's a bit more chemistry in their romance in that they actually talk and connect before deciding to get together, unlike the original where they awkwardly laugh before just cutting to them getting married. They're also made to be more involved in the story, along with Nanny 2. They stand their ground when telling off Cruella, they're passionately devoted to taking care of the dogs, and they're also smarter in this one by actually figuring out Cruella's plan. They feel more confident and present in the story, unlike the original where they can't put two and two together to figure out Cruella was behind the kidnapping. Then they just disappear until the last 3 minutes of the movie. Even Horace and Jasper are given more characterization. Their begrudging attitude towards Cruella shows how they follow her out of fear instead of any sort of loyalty. It's also more relatable as it could be argued they don't even like her or enjoy the job of killing dogs, and they're only working with her out of desperation. Even the roast at the end when Cruella says everyone won the bronze, silver, and gold in Idiot Olympics and Jasper says Cruella won the gold is a really funny example of how more fleshed out they are. If anything, they'll think of getting apprehended by the police as freedom, as they'll now be as far away from this woman as possible. They even created a new villain. This Mr. Skinner guy who works for Cruella as the one who skins animals for her clothes is pretty creepy but interesting. He doesn't have any vocal cords, meaning he has to carry out his performance without any dialogue, and he actually does it pretty well. He manages to get a lot of sinister across using just his body language and facial expressions. There's a wide variety of menace in his acting, and he even manages to get some good personality across. Actually, all of the human actors in this movie are great. Their line deliveries and chemistry with each other are focused and properly played out. No one feels miscasted or out of place, which is pretty interesting considering the all-star cast they got for these characters. Much like The Jungle Book 1994, it's interesting to see the early stages of their careers. As for the story, it's also very well done. It maintains a lighthearted and engaging tone similar to the original. There's peril in the movie, but never anything that gets too intense or unfitting. There's plenty of good recreations of classic scenes from the original while adding their own spin on them, like the Twilight Bark. And unlike Lady and the Tramp, the original movie wasn't told from just the perspective of dogs, so they're able to flesh out the human characters without breaking the mood. It finds a really good compromise between capturing the essence of the original and updating some of its elements. And this is actually the key element that makes this movie work. Unlike all the other movies I talked about before, this one is a remake that manages to tell the story faithfully, but not in the exact same way the original did. It's similar, but still has enough differences to be its own film and not just a copy-paste job. And in some ways, it even manages to have better pacing. The Twilight Bark scene is done so much better by getting to the point and not dragging around with the side characters too much. It allows the plot to keep on rolling instead of just stopping for a while. This is one of the few live-action remakes that manages to put its longer runtime to good use, fleshing out the characters and adding new content without wasting time or derailing the plot. You can tell that it was directed with a lot of passion towards classic filmmaking and with devoted love to both the animated movie and the original book. But the most impressive thing about this movie is the miraculous training that was given to the animals. It's very different from the Jungle Book where the animals are side characters, so the story doesn't rely on them. In 101 Dalmatians, the animals are central characters, so they needed to be trained very well to act out the story, and the level of training that was given to them is jaw-droppingly stunning. Like, it's actually mind-blowing that they took the time to train the dogs and the other animals the way they did. They're incredibly smart and manage to perform all sorts of complex tasks throughout the movie. The dogs perfectly keep their composure with incredible focus and devotion to their roles. Even the puppies manage to pull off very good performances. They behave intelligently and interact with the humans very well. So much care and delicacy was put into training the animals for this movie, allowing them to come across as really smart while still behaving like animals. And it was a really good change to not make them talk either, allowing us to read their emotions and body language more appropriately. In spite of having no dialogue, the dogs managed to have so much character. You can see how they feel and how they communicate with each other by just their gestures and eye contact. There's 3 particular scenes in the movie that really hit home how amazing they are. The first one is when Lucky is born. Pongo looks so worried and concerned, and you see him communicating with Roger to help him just by looking at him, and he's so relieved when he comes back to life, barking in joy that he survived. Every expression from Pongo was done just right. His sadness and fear of losing a child, communicating with Roger to help him, and his happiness and relief that Lucky survived. The second one is Pongo and Perdita finding out their children were kidnapped. They look purely heartbroken and shocked in disbelief while letting out distressed whimpers. Perdita sits cradled in their bed as Pongo tries to comfort her as the two try to make sense of what just happened, with their owner sharing in their grief. It's an incredible display of silent storytelling, where we can fully understand what's happening without any dialogue explaining the situation or emotions of the characters. And the third is when they reunite with the puppies during the rescue. When they find them in the barn, they look to each other in relief that their puppies are together and safe. Then, just like the animated version, Perdita snuggles alongside her children when they've been found, just soaking in their essence to reassure her that they're safe. It's a really heartwarming reunion between the family. And once again, it's done with no dialogue to break the mood of the scene. There's so many moments like this throughout the movie, where the dogs and other animals are able to display so much emotion and it's able to further the story without a single spoken word. It's an amazing display of filmmaking when you're able to accomplish something like this, let alone with animals instead of human actors. And keep in mind, these are all real animals. None of them were CGI and were trained to do all these things. This is not the kind of thing that Disney would do anymore. A movie where the animals don't talk, aren't done with CGI, and are trained to do all these things by professional trainers. The devotion and commitment the people behind this one had is spectacular. They truly actually cared about making this movie feel practical and real. You want to know the difference between this movie and the so-called live-action Lion King? These animals have actual honest-to-God emotion. You can read how the animals feel and how they communicate with each other. And in spite of not being able to talk, they still manage to display so much personality. This movie would not have worked as well if they made the animals talk. It would have taken away from the emotion and weight of the story by trying to make them too human. In the original, it made sense for them to talk because it was animated and the characters needed to be personified. But in this version that's trying to be more realistic, they actually kept things realistic with the animals. If anything, this was a great example of how you can accomplish so much with the limitations of live action. I'm still awestruck by how fantastically this movie aged after all these years. This is the only one of the Disney live action remakes where I was watching this and I said, wow, that was really good. I wish that was in the original. I think that's a pretty big assessment that this one more than deserves the #1 spot. But, is it better than the original? Well, I can understand why someone would prefer this over the original, but I don't know if I would go that far. I would say they have the same level of quality, having both advantages and disadvantages over the other. The main advantage the original has over the remake is the fact that it's animated, where there's no limitations to what can be done with the movie. The biggest example is the danger the Dalmatians face when trying to return home. There's actually a lot of peril while they're traveling, like trying to make it through a heavy snowstorm. The animation showed how much strain was placed on the Dalmatians. They were exhausted and weak, and the tired tone in their vocals added to the danger they were in. The remake isn't able to replicate that danger, which removes the tension the original had. But honestly, that's a moot point to make when the movie manages to have so much quality overall. As a standalone movie and as a remake, 101 Dalmatians 1996 gets just about everything right. The villain, the characters, the acting, the cinematography, the animals, the pacing, the framing of the story. This Disney live-action remake actually feels right. It's an honest-to-God faithful adaptation of one of Disney's animated classics, and everyone did a great job bringing it to life. I've recently had a really strong fondness for 101 Dalmatians as it's become one of Disney's most fascinating movies to me. Not one of their best, but I was really charmed by its story and characters and interested in how it expanded as a brand. I was also really fascinated by how this movie actually saved the company from going under after the underperformance of Sleeping Beauty. So yeah, 101 Dalmatians is one of the most important movies Disney ever made as its overwhelming success revitalized the animation company. It's actually thanks to 101 Dalmatians that we still have Disney today, for better or for worse. So seeing it being given proper respect with this remake is incredibly satisfying. Everything in it was just done so well, and I still can't believe it managed to set the bar this high almost 30 years ago. When you can pull off something like that, chances are you deserve to win the contest. It's a charming delight from the moment it starts all the way to the credits, making it my pick for the #1 Disney live-action remake. Well, That was my journey through the Disney live-action remakes, at least the ones that qualified for this particular list. And I have to say, it was certainly an experience. I think it really says something about how horrible this trend is when out of all these movies only 2 of them are actually good. And those movies were released over 25 years ago. The Jungle Book 2016 was alright at best, and Cinderella was frustrating due to its horrible portrayal of the character and the message. Aladdin was in the top 5 and it was still a bad movie, and everything below it ranged from boring to obnoxious to painful to infuriating. So did any good come out of this? Well, if there was one thing these remakes did right, it was helping us look back on the originals and realizing how great they are, allowing us to appreciate them more. Comparing these movies back to back really gave me an assessment of how well the animated versions aged, with their mature stories and characters and really smart comedic writing. I honestly don't think I would have been able to really recognize how well these elements were without something to compare them, and comparing them to their live-action counterparts felt like the best way to do it. I still would prefer it if Disney stopped making these horrible reboots, but at the very least it does give me something interesting to talk about. It was actually kind of fun seeing how these remakes compare to the original, highlighting all the things that were amazing about the animated movies while figuring out the finer details to what made the remakes bad. It helps to demonstrate how underappreciated animation is as an art form, and exploring how these movies aged over time is a good way to give it the respect it deserves. Even if there's no sign of these remakes stopping anytime soon, there's still something fonder for us to look back on. And I guess going through these remakes wasn't all bad. I'll admit there were times I was surprised by some of these movies with their more quality elements. Hell, if it wasn't for me deciding to do this list, I never would have known about the 1994 version of The Jungle Book, and marvel at how much of a hidden gem it is. So I guess there was more good that ended up coming out of this than I expected, even giving me something to exercise my critical thinking and analysis, and just in time for a certain other remake around the corner. But still, it was interesting going through these movies. It gave me a chance to reflect on how magnificent Disney's animated classics are, and why there's still a reason we feel a connection to the brand in spite of all the bullshit. It certainly hasn't been easy, but as long as we have the classics, we'll still have something to keep us pushing forward. With that said, thank you for watching the video from beginning to end. I really appreciate those who actually support my work and listen to what I have to say. If you're interested in what I may come up with in the future, feel free to support me on Patreon. It's a nice way for me to connect with my audience, and you can have your name featured in future videos for your support. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, stay cool.